roughly 400 years ago, I made a retrospective on the first 4 .hack games, and I really enjoyed making that. So here I am with a sequel exploring the trilogy that followed a few short years later. .hack GU. True to form as a multimedia project, GU would also tell its tale across not only 3 games, but an anime, a movie, and a handful of manga. As far as I can tell though, the movie and manga are retellings of the same story found in the games, but with certain liberties taken when it comes to the finer details or how certain events play out. For this video, I've played through the .hack GU trilogy. Of course, I'll be covering the recent-ish HD remaster of those games, Last Recode, which came with a shiny new playable epilogue, so I guess the trilogy is now a tetralogy. So as not to bury the lead, despite how much more fulfilling this second leg of the journey was in a narrative and character sense, I left it feeling just as torn about the overall experience as before. Don't get me wrong, I quite enjoy these games, and I hope to illustrate why over the course of this video. They can be as much of a slog as Infection Through Quarantine, with the same pacing issues in those titles to be found here, born no doubt of yet another attempt to turn one game into several and pad out the runtime. But when I crossed the finish line and reflected on my experience, I found that there was a lot to enjoy and appreciate, rooted in both character and gameplay improvements. Nothing here is perfect, of course, but nothing ever is, and nothing ever needs to be. This is your spoiler warning for pretty much anything .hack. If you're not familiar with the previous set of games, and you should be, you can watch my, or really anyone else's video on the subject matter, or play through the games yourself. Or else strap in and prepare for what I'm sure is going to sound like an absolute fever dream to the uninitiated. Alright, where were we? Last we left off, Kite, Black Rose, Balmung, and the rest of the hackers successfully took down the program Morgana and helped Aura achieve status as the ultimate AI, stabilizing the network and restoring the coma victims who were trapped inside the game. What followed was an era of relative peace and prosperity for the world itself, but outside, the winds were shifting. As mentioned at the end of Quarantine, an FBI investigation into the Ultimate OS and CyberConnect put a ton of pressure on the 2 corporations, though they were predictably able to skirt much of the blame by scapegoating one of their administrators. Nevertheless, their reputations took a bit of a hit, and with the dissolution of the World Network Commission, regulations laxed enough to allow alternative operating systems to be created for the first time in nearly 6 years. This is why the stability of the world was so important to these 2 companies. It allowed them to make huge leaps in gaining back the public's trust. There was a wrinkle though. The second network crisis showed CC Corp that they never had full control over the world due to their inability to access the black box left behind by its creator, and they needed control fast. But their efforts were hardly fruitful, and the era of peace came to an abrupt end following a series of escalating events best given context a little later. But the long and short of it is, Aura went missing and there was a mysterious fire at the CC Corp headquarters that wiped out much of the game's data. In the aftermath of this travesty, they shut down service and launched a sequel to the game hardly a year later, The World R2. Side note, I'll be trying to refer to the in-universe game as R2 as much as possible, because saying the world all the time, well, it's sometimes unclear if I'm talking about the game, the real world within .hack, our world, or just the .hack universe as a whole. Anyways, that's all we need to know to get the ball rolling, so let's hop right in. Volume 1 Rebirth kicks off 7 years after the finale of the previous game, with our new protagonist booting up R2 for the first time and creating his player character, an adept rogue by the name of Haseo. Now, there's no other way to put this, but Haseo is a nigh irredeemable prick, a grade A turd. I'll be commentating on his development throughout the course of the video, but your mileage will likely vary with how much you can handle from him in this opening installment. In fact, I'm fairly positive one reason I never bothered to pick up the second or third games back in the day was because I simply didn't like him. But he doesn't start out like this, and he has an understandable reason for his initial personality. Likewise, it forms the foundation for the growth he'll undertake over the next 100 hours of playtime, so bear with him for now. One of the first things you'll notice in .hack GU is the lack of that foreboding, mysterious atmosphere that enshrouded IMOX so completely. But I don't think that's a problem, as that's not the focus of this newer set of games. There is certainly an element of mystery to them, but GU is a much more character-driven tale. It's largely concerned with people trying desperately to find meaningful connections with others in an online game while the outside world becomes increasingly disconnected from reality. As many issues as I have with various writing decisions, throughout the narrative, I felt that plot developments were mostly the natural results of character decisions and actions. This is a slow burn, sometimes to its detriment, but as I'll explain, by the end, you sort of realize that that's the point, and it manages to stick the landing if you're able to hold on and invest. The first time Haseo logs on, he's just a bright-eyed youth suckered into going on an adventure with two player killers, posing as helpful guides for new players. As the title implies, player killers, PKs for short, are griefers who enjoy going around and tormenting other players for fun, killing them off and stealing their loot. Haseo's own encounter with these two predictably goes south, but he's saved by the timely intervention of another player, Ovan. Now, for maximum immersion, you could pause the game right here and watch the .hack Roots anime, because it mostly takes place between this and the very next cutscene. I don't recommend that though, for a multitude of reasons, ranging from my overall thoughts on the quality of the product to the fact that around halfway through, it begins to lean pretty heavily into spoiling the second game's big reveal. In any case, the story of Roots covers Haseo's time with Ovan and another character named Shino after he joins them in their hunt for the ever-elusive Key of the Twilight. I'll cover this a tad more later. For now, all you need to know is that Shino is PK'd by another player named Triedge and she falls into a coma. This sets Haseo off on a single-minded quest for revenge, and the very next cutscene picks up here. 6 months later, Haseo is every 14-year-old boy's power fantasy. A spike and belt-clad player killer, now known as the Terror of Death, who can one-shot anything with smug ease. As a player killer, a PK who exclusively hunts other PKers, Haseo's hoping that slicing through enough of them will put him on the trail to Triedge, but his first real lead comes from an increasingly distant Ovan, and he winds up visiting the Hulgrans Cathedral. You know, that church from the other games. Here, Haseo's ambushed by a figure who can only be Triedge, and who looks suspiciously like the protagonist of the previous series of games. I bet you can guess how this goes. Haseo is soundly beaten and data drained by his foe. The experience knocks him out for a few moments, and when he wakes up in the real world, he finds that his computer has been reformatted and his character returned to level 1. Forced to start his journey over from the beginning, the game begins. Righto. Like last time, the first thing I want to address is our handy desktop, because it's here where we first gain control of the action. While what you're seeing here is mostly an aesthetic change, like Ultimate went from Windows to Mac, a lot of what is found here is mostly the same. We still read and reply to our emails from here, but those have been expanded upon a bit, with threads of conversation that change slightly depending on your responses. The affection mechanic has returned as well, so as usual, you'll want to choose the best replies, which are usually obvious, and you can track how characters' affections have grown in your list of contacts. The news section has also returned in all its glory, and it remains our method of building an understanding of the world at large as the story unfolds. The biggest upgrade here is the inclusion of news videos to accompany most articles. And while these quick pieces rarely have critical information not contained within the articles themselves, they go a long way in enhancing the feeling of authenticity in this interface. But more than that, they'll work wonders for B-roll I'll be using going forward. The forums are now split between a board specific to R2 and a board for general discussion outside of the game. But it still functions in much the same way, though much more polite than forums in our world. And it's still a really immersive tool for getting steeped in the story, as there's a plethora of different characters that'll discuss the latest trends, news, and whatever else is going on. The message boards are a bit more interactive this time around. Nothing that really engages in the core plot, but you can reply to posts that your party members make to increase their affection level or else pick up side quests by asking different posters details about an area they went to. Easily the most interesting addition to the forum is the inclusion of Apkalu. Think DeviantArt, if that's still a thing. It's a message board exclusively for artists who want to share their artwork and the people who enjoy it. In the previous games, you would obtain wallpapers for your desktop through a count of how many monsters you defeated or data drained or other yardsticks. It was a tool completely detached from the rest of the game. But this time around, all of our wallpaper comes from these posts, with artists explaining their inspiration and responses from people that go on to build a small narrative around each piece. There's even inconsequential sub-stories that unfold on this board, such as an artist who was eventually hired by CC Corp to create illustrations for their card game. The developers didn't have to give what is essentially completely optional side content any of this context, but they did, and I really appreciate it. For the previous tetralogy, each game came bundled with a short OVA as part of a series called Liminality, which covered a set of characters investigating CC Corp in the real world. Replacing these in .hack GU is Online Jack, an investigative web series released in segments over the course of the first 3 games, and though its host Salvador Ihara is a fucking creep and his show absolutely deserves to get canned, we'll still be checking in with him from time to time as he investigates doll syndrome, an aptly named mysterious illness that's on the rise in children and gamers, leaving them unresponsive and doll-like. Overall, not much has been greatly changed, but change wasn't really necessary. What they've done here is exactly what they needed to do: streamline the experience a bit, flesh it out, and give it a new coat of paint. Following the reformat of his PC, Haseo receives an email from Ovan presenting him with a choice. He can either log off for good and remain happy yet ignorant, or he can start up his pursuit of Tri-Edge once more. A path that Ovan asserts will be laid with trials and turmoil, but also truth. As an audience member, we need only to witness the trifecta of Ovan's mysterious tip leading to the zombified kite, his prompt email thereafter, and frankly, his look to know that he's up to some seriously shady shit. But for Haseo, the answer is obvious. He logs back in. Despite having once been part of a guild, Haseo played R2 almost exclusively alone. And while he was certainly physically strong, he never had the kind of strength needed for the trials and turmoil ahead. To attain that strength, he's going to have to learn how to work with others and grow to care for more than just his own goal. To that end, the majority of Volume 1 is focused on throwing the characters who will affect this growth onto Haseo's path, and he meets the 2 who plant the seeds for the slow change immediately after logging back in. Syllabus and Gaspard run Canard, a guild dedicated to helping out new players, which they believe Haseo to be. They're largely responsible for this game taking forever to get going, but I wound up liking them regardless, especially Gaspard. Unlike the pair who had hoodwinked our protagonist a few months ago, these 2 are completely earnest in their attempts to show him the ropes. In Haseo's mind, the most important thing is regaining his lost power, so he joins the 2 with the aim of using them to do some quick leveling up. Haseo at this point is his usual self, aloof but quick-tempered, selfish and demeaning. He bats away all their advice and, in general, doesn't understand how they find this game fun in the slightest. After all, for him, R2 is just a means to an end. However, along the way, something unexpected happens. He learns something he didn't know about the game's battle system. So combat is yet another element of the originals that received a massive overhaul going into GU. And the changes are noticeable even at a glance. One of the larger structural complaints they levied at the past titles was an over-reliance on opening and navigating menus constantly to get anywhere in battle. Gaining any sense of momentum was like trying to push a boulder uphill, but this time they've placed a much heavier emphasis on keeping players in the moment as much as possible. The monotonous pace of Kite's endless 1-2 combo are gone, replaced by longer strings of combos with weapons that hit faster and have more variations of attack sequences depending on the make. You can cut down on incoming damage by blocking, and hold the attack button to deal out heavy blows that can break your opponent's guard. As a new class, the Adept Rogue, Haseo starts off with 2 short swords, but over the course of the games, will undertake job extensions that will increase his repertoire of weapons to include the most obnoxiously large swords you've ever seen, and scythes. These aren't just visual changes or ways to hit harder, however, as enemies are weak to different weapon types. While elemental damage is still a thing, there is a much lesser focus on it than is typical of games of this genre, which is understandable given the action RPG focus this system now has, but something I find somewhat disappointing. Enemies no longer even display their elemental affinity. It's all about the weapons, to which skills are no longer tied. Instead, you gain new skills through continued use of a particular weapon type. You can still open up your menu and navigate to your skill of choice, but the skill trigger gives you quick access to up to 4 different abilities so you can continue to pile up the damage without interrupting your flow. There is one temporary caveat to all this. After getting Haseo's first job extension towards the end of Volume 1, you have to navigate into the menu to shift between his twin blades and broadswords. This was mercifully rectified in Volume 2, which allows you to assign skills from different weapon types to the skill trigger, so you can change your gear on the fly and react to whatever's in front of you as rapidly as possible. The skill trigger has one other function, known as Rengeki. Once you've hit an enemy enough times, you get an opening to deal double damage with the skill, and it nets you some additional experience points. As an aside, the slowing of the attack animation and audio design when performing a Rengeki really sells the feeling that you're pummeling monsters into oblivion. As for the combat mechanic that Haseo was unaware of, in the top right of the screen here, you probably noticed the morale gauge. This fills up when using combos and spells, but fills up exponentially quicker when performing Rengekis. Once topped off, you can unleash an even more powerful group attack, of which there are several variations. In a narrative sense, Haseo's lack of knowledge of this mechanic until playing with Silbus and Gaspard further emphasizes the extent to which Haseo played alone during his pre-data drain days, and teases the lesson that he'll be learning throughout his entire character arc, that he's much stronger with friends. On the equipment side, it's been downscaled in terms of the amount of gear you need to worry about, but also deepened when it comes to what you can do with them. Now you only have to deal with your weapons, armor, and a single accessory, all of which can be imbued with abilities using items you collect in the field. These augments include everything from status attacks, so you can inflict things like sleep or charm on your foes, to increasing received experience. It's a good system, and one that allows you to still carry around a different set of weapons to suit whatever situation you might encounter, if that's your sort of thing. Additionally, you can also use alchemy to make new items, though to be honest, alchemy's mostly just a good way to make loads of money. When all said and done, this evolution to the combat makes for a fantastic improvement over what came before, and it's something that holds up to this day, even if it's not incredibly deep or super polished. So, everything here is good, but what's my criticism? Well, truth be told, there isn't much to actively dislike. It's just that everything here eventually wears out its welcome after the first 40 or so hours, but this isn't a problem with the battle system itself. It's an issue that stems from a marketing decision to stretch this game into 3. This is one 50-hour experience pulled across 3 games totaling around 110 odd hours. But I defy you to find any game from its generation whose combat doesn't wear at least a little thin after a couple dozen hours. But seriously, don't bother naming games, I'm just making a point. What's here is fine, good even. It just has the unfortunate duty of running a marathon it never trained for. This first installment of GU is all about handing Haseo the keys to his growth into an overall better person. These first 2 he meets along this path, Silbus and Gaspard, never become intimately involved with the core plot of the series. In fact, they remain fairly ignorant of the deeper happenings throughout, but they'll be present from beginning to end because they'll continue to unknowingly anchor Haseo whenever he begins to obsess too much over the hunt for Tri-Edge, and also because Haseo winds up becoming their guildmaster. Yeah, it's a quick development, and done mostly to open up the alchemy and shop running components of the game, but Haseo winds up taking over the guild after getting roped into helping Gaspard run their shop. He gives a discount to this kid named Bo, who's trying to buy a gift for his sister Saku, who shares his player character. I absolutely abhor this brother-sister pair, Saku mostly, for admittedly stupid reasons we'll get into later, but Silbus hears about Haseo's good deed and decides, hey, Haseo's a good guy, why doesn't he run the guild? Witness to these events is Adelie, whom Haseo has run into a few times before now. Mostly, he finds her in the guild she belongs to, Moontree, preachy and self-righteous. In short, they're a guild made up of players who patrol R2 and attempt to keep PKers from PKing and promote harmony. Sort of like volunteer hall monitors trying to enforce federal law. Adelie, for her part, annoys Haseo to no end. The way he sees it, she's got no mind of her own, always parroting the messages of her unit leader Sakaki, and she finds little to no joy in engaging with the actual mechanics of the game itself. Adelie doesn't care much for battle, and even refuses to kick lucky animals, monsters whose sole mechanic is to be kicked in order to bestow benefits on the players. She much prefers looking at the grass and the sky. Even if they're digital, she thinks that the time designers and artists spent working on the environments necessitates appreciation. Yeah, she's a bit of an odd duck, but who isn't? Every individual has their own way of playing that brings them joy and is equally as valid as others, and Adelie here is the very personification of that idea. She's joined the world for her own reasons, some very personal, deeply disturbing ones, but nevertheless, her idea of having fun is spreading Moontree's message and taking in the sights. Of course, Haseo hasn't had fun a single time in his entire life, and for him, the game is no more than a vehicle for pursuing Tri-Edge. But what's at first a simple outing for gaining more levels winds up getting T-boned by the main plot when the two come across Tri-Edge's sign. These signs appear wherever the elusive villain strikes and are capable of acting as gateways to other areas, and curiously enough, Adelie seems capable of hearing them. So Haseo and Adelie are teleported to an underground lake where they encounter this fabulous yet slightly familiar-looking character accompanied by a cat and some pulsing black dots. We'll learn more about these black dots and the creatures born from them, all called Ida, in due time. But in the meantime, they incapacitate Adelie, and Haseo watches as this new Gaikun transforms into Magus and they dispatch the unknown entity. If you're familiar with IMOC, you're probably confused by all of this. Come to think of it, you're probably even more confused if you're not. Wasn't Magus one of the 8 phases of the Cursed Wave, born from Morgana's attempt to keep Aura from awakening? Didn't Kite defeat all 8 phases and send them packing by the end of quarantine? How can a player turn into Magus? Well, the answers to those questions are yes, and okay, that last one's gonna be a bit longer. Found within the main menu for Last Recode is the Terminal Disk, an in-universe video diary left behind by a CyberConnect employee that goes on to explain much of what happened during the 7 years between IMOC and GU. With Morgana defeated and the disaster of the Second Network Crisis not so much averted as it was curbed, CC Corp was made starkly aware that their inability to access the black box left behind by Herald meant that they had much less control over the world than the public knew. The problem was, it was really hard to care just then. Thanks to Aura, they were making fat stacks because the game and the network were more stable than ever. Aura acted as a 24/7 pro bono programmer and debugger, creating her own events and ensuring that the game she oversaw was an enjoyable experience for all. But the problem with leaving your corporation's cash cow in the hands of an autonomous digital being who neither answers to you nor cares what you think is that when they decide to take a vacation, well, your product's in jeopardy. Why Aura left and where she went is something both addressed and left somewhat ambiguous by the game's end. But when she did leave, CC Corp created a task force of researchers and programmers, charging them with returning stability to the system and putting it at last under their control. This task force, Project GU, was led by our video diary author himself, Jun Bansoya. Over the course of his entries, it's explained that his team came to the conclusion that they could create their own ultimate AI by scouring the network and recovering the fragments of data that made up the 8 phases of the Cursed Wave. The idea was to place these entities within the character data of actual players under their employ for full control, which, of course, went about as badly as it could go. These poor bastards attempted to activate the 8 phases and were driven insane, or in the case of Jun's right-hand man, fell into hysteria and set fire to the building, which destroyed the game's servers. These phases, now called avatars, were mostly able to slink back to the network and search out compatible players they could attach themselves to. Jun himself avoided all this and disappeared from CC Corp after stealing one of the avatars, spurred on by the revelation that gathering these new versions of the infamously powerful Cursed Wave would give rise to another anti-existence-like being similar to Kubia, which means I need to correct something. In part 1 of this retrospective, I said it was probably safe to assume that Kubia was the trash bin of Kite's Twilight bracelet, something that existed purely because of the bracelet and grew in size as Kite data drained monsters and the 8 phases over the course of the games. But it turns out I was probably most definitely very wrong. Kubia is simply an anti-existence, a being created by the system to counter a particular growing threat. Do I have a problem with this? You better believe it. It means there's no deeper explanation to this thing's creation. Saying it just springs into existence to run counter to threats is an incredibly boring justification and feels as if no thought went into it other than, this sounds cool. Being the data drained from Kite's bracelet given purpose by Morgana didn't have to be the only explanation, but it at least meant that there was a reason and utility to Kubia's power and growth. Is there some wider context I'm missing that could reframe this idea for me and make it better? Maybe. Perhaps there's some cultural inspiration that Kubia draws from buried somewhere in the subtext, or else maybe the idea is rooted in programming and coding, similar to the Matrix's idea of there being an equation constantly trying to balance itself out. But if the latter is true, the game does nothing to properly present this idea and give it any sort of thematic resonance. It just comes off as things happening because the script dictates that they must. Now, this doesn't retroactively harm IMOC's story, but it does plant the seeds for some massive damage done to the narrative of these games, which we'll discuss during Volume 3. But I guess this is all just part of growing up, accepting that your headcanon isn't canon. Gripes with the Kubia explanation aside, the terminal disc content is all around solid. The downfall of the first version of the world is easily some of the more interesting lore that this era of the franchise has to offer, and though June's video diary is the most detailed account of these events, the bare essentials are given to us piecemeal throughout GU itself. Project GU's goal these days is twofold: to observe and eliminate the errant data known as IDA and gather as many Epitaph users as possible. What exactly IDA is currently unknown, but the avatars, which remain invisible to normal players, are the only power capable of neutralizing them. Which is necessary, because if the team is right and IDA and Triage are linked, then these two are behind this new string of coma victims. So Kun is one of these new avatar wielders, and he invites Haseo to chat with the most current iteration of Project GU, led by fellow Epitaph users Yada and Pi. Haseo is able to suss out pretty quickly that these guys work for CyberConnect, but is disappointed to discover that they know little more than he does about the IDA phenomenon or Triage. But he does learn that his character is also an Epitaph user, and so he enters a tenuous partnership with the group, in which they'll give him information on Triage if he helps them in their investigation. But summoning an avatar doesn't come down to entering a specific button combination on a controller. It comes down to the mind of the player and their avatar being in sync. You might question the means through which data can interface with the minds of players, but we're dealing with a series in which people's minds can be trapped inside of a game, so we're not really placing any stress on our suspension of disbelief here. To that end, I won't be endlessly commentating on how seriously the characters in .hack treat the game they play. To varying degrees, this is explained away by IDA, or Artificially Intelligent Data Anomalies. These naturally occurring AIs are all different, some benign, others aggressive, but all are connected, and as we'll learn, seek to understand human emotions. If they infect a player, they can even heighten and manipulate those emotions, which will be painstakingly demonstrated to us in due time. By this point in the game, we gain access to Lumina Cloth, the only other server town in Volume 1, and you better get used to it because we'll be seeing a lot of it in the future. It seems that over the years, player killing became so commonplace that CC Corp made a server with a dedicated player arena where PKers could duke it out in a controlled environment. The hope being that it would curtail the amount of players who were being targeted. It doesn't seem to have worked very well though, because mostly it's used as a place for PKers to flex on each other and spread their name. We're here for a specific reason though. One of the arena's emperors, Endrance, is both an Epitaph user and infected by IDA. Even worse, it appears he's awakened to his avatar and has been using it to hold down his title as Emperor. The power of an epitaph used on another player is potentially dangerous, and when compounded by IDA's presence, there's no telling what kind of damage he may end up doing if he carries on. And so we're given our North Star for the remainder of the game. Work our way up through the ranks of the player arena so we can properly confront and investigate this new epitaph and learn more about IDA. For Haseo's arc, this is a pretty smart decision. While he has yet to awaken as an Epitaph user, Yada and Pi recruited him early in order to steer the way in which he uses that power once he eventually figures out how to tap into it. This is in contrast with Endrance, who awakened to this ability on his own and has been using it in ways that could potentially cause harm to others. Obviously, Haseo only sees power for power's sake, so everything that's about to happen does so in the service of him learning a very difficult lesson when he later nearly gets lost in the power of his avatar. But in the present, our biggest concern is gathering a team so we can enter the arena. Haseo doesn't have a lot of people to choose from, and after Syllabus joins the cause, he recommends that we find a Harvest Cleric to round out our team. The problem is, we only know one, and she's not too fond of fighting. Adelie will join our roster, eventually, but first we have to suffer what is possibly Haseo's lowest moment when he invites Adelie out with the intention of asking her to join his team. For as much as Adelie expresses her distaste in the tournaments because of the violence and narrow-mindedness that she perceives in leveling up and lording rank over others, it's also clear that had Haseo simply been straightforward with her, she would have engaged with a mechanic that she dislikes because it would have helped a friend. But instead, Haseo blows up at her after enduring a tour of some of her favorite spots in the world. As I said, this is Haseo at his worst, and what's remarkable is that Adelie would ever interact with this guy again. While I don't think that this game does a good enough job to convince us that there's a strong enough bond between these two at the start capable of overcoming this outburst, the next title does eventually put in the work to illustrate why Adelie would put up with this abuse. Having successfully frightened her off, we're left to try and find a cleric through the forums, but the answer to our ZipRecruiter post winds up being a trap sprung by Bordeaux, a PKer with a grudge against Haseo, though the fight is broken up by Sakaki and Adelie. Sakaki doesn't have too much of a role to play in Volume 1. Whenever he does appear, it's often coupled with a sermon about how PKing is bad, and followed by Haseo telling him to fuck off in some variation. It's pretty easy for both the protagonist and the player to see through Sakaki's facade, but he's not completely relevant yet, so let's table the discussion of his character for now and move on. Good news, after this run-in, Adelie's decided that she's going to help us anyways, which means our main focus is now climbing the ranks in the palace to qualify for the next tournament and doing some side quests in order to level up. I'm happy to report that side quests are very much improved in GU. You can pick up a vast majority of these at a quest shop, and they typically see you doing things like taking down a boss or collecting a particular item from an area. Normally the rewards are worth it though. Most quests are reasonably short and give you an item for permanent stat boosts that can be dumped into our main guy. Some of the other side content takes the form of collectathons. Goblin racing makes its return, this time utilizing the bike that you can ride and customize, and there's also bounties you can collect by hunting player killers. There is more, and as I understand it, each game builds slightly upon the last, though I wound up not digging too deeply into this stuff. But it's good to know that it's all there. They go far to sell the idea that this game within a game is something that people might actually play. Some of these quest lines are part of in-game campaigns that follow the lore of R2. One I absolutely recommend doing is available after Volume 2 closes, and it allows you to take on the One Sin, the creature Balmung and Orca slew that raised the two to the status of legends in the old version of the world. While much easier than I anticipated, seeing it through nets you the Rainbow Scale, a piece of armor that cuts down on incoming physical damage by a significant amount, and it will likely be the last armor you'll need. A handful of these side quests are done as part of our main quest, however. The most noteworthy being the job extension quest that Haseo can take on. We get one in this game that nets him his best character design and the use of broadswords, and another in the following game that sees him regain the use of scythes. Bordeaux makes a reappearance, this time as our first opponent in the tournament once we've secured our spot, but now Haseo has a bit of a grudge. Since the encounter that Sakaki and Adelie broke up, Bordeaux and members from her guild have been targeting and killing any players who've bought from our guild shop, resulting in players avoiding Canard altogether. Given that this is Haseo's guild and he's grown to feel some sense of ownership over it, it's natural that he would feel attacked, but there is more to this. Gaspard, remember Gaspard? Well, he's on the verge of quitting because of this development. Interacting with other players through the guild is a large part of how and why he plays, and with Bordeaux and her cronies having successfully isolated Canard, he no longer finds the game fun. But Gaspard's not going to quit, and we'll revisit him later, but this does flip a switch in Haseo's mind. I feel like I've said this 100 times, so say it with me. For Haseo, this online game is all about finding Tri-Edge, but this is where it really sinks in that his personal quest is a complete anomaly, something happening in the background that normal players like Gaspard know nothing about. And the fact that Bordeaux has purposely fucked with Gaspard's fun just to get at Haseo, well, it pisses him off. This essentially becomes the first time that he fights on the behalf of another. All this baggage is carried into this fight with Bordeaux, and when he nearly loses, he finally awakens to his avatar, Skaith. Awash with renegade energy, he uses it on his foe, fully aware of the potential danger. This moment scares Adelie, who can also see the Avatar, hint hint, and Kun and Pai are less than thrilled at the flippant way in which Haseo regards this immense responsibility. But this is Haseo's drunk on power phase, so their words fall on deaf ears. With access to Scathe comes access to Avatar battles, a completely separate battle system that I did not anticipate, which sees you fighting different Ida variants and even other phases. These battles are all rather straightforward, giving you omnidirectional movement and forcing you to shoot down a barrier in order to move in and deal the real damage with Scathe's melee attacks. Once you whittle an enemy's health down, you get an opening to perform a data drain on them, the only way to neutralize Ida or extract it from infected players. Avatar battles are a nice change of pace from the usual flow of things, but they're also too few and far between to allow for much depth. I do have two particular issues with the system though, which I'll rant about in the future during the battle that gave me the most grief. So now we're running missions with GU to investigate Ida, which will usually boil down to running through 3 floors of a dungeon and dealing with an Ida form at the end. We'll be doing a lot of that. One of these missions does see Pai taking a hit for another set of players that were in the area. She's infected and we're forced into our first Avatar on Avatar battle to extract this thing. She's fine. Turns out the 2 people we rescued were 2 of the leaders of Moontree, Adelie's guild. Their leader Zelkova invites us to their headquarters for a quick chat and a thank you. For all their bluster about hugs and friendship, we learn that Moontree is becoming increasingly divided between Zelkova and Sakaki, who sits on their council, so we've got a good old-fashioned coup brewing in the background. The rest of Volume 1, and a good portion of Volumes 2 and 3, rely heavily upon the much-beloved Shonen Tournament arc setup, and I don't have too much to say about either of our subsequent opponents, Matsu and Alcade, at the present. Haseo is still very much reveling in how easy victory has come with the awakening of his avatar, though he gets a reality check upon fighting Kun, who entered the tournament to give Project GU 2 bites at the apple. An avatar battle between the 2 erupts as a result of Haseo's frustration that Kun and Pai seemingly won't recognize as power. But when he loses control of his emotions and Scathe takes over, he witnesses for himself just how easy it would be for him to do to other players what Tri-Edge did to Shino. This is Haseo's big wake-up call, and the turning point from which he begins to develop awareness of his responsibility as an epitaph user, and becomes a lot more understanding of others as a result. Kun's fine, by the way. A tense moment and a difficult lesson, somewhat undercut by there being 0 repercussions for Haseo's loss of control. At long last, our path to Entrance is unobscured. If you're familiar with IMOC, you might look at Entrance's character design and this cat that he calls Mia and wonder if he has any connection to Elk, and you would be right. Elk and Entrance are one and the same. Unfortunately, Elk's life doesn't seem to have improved much over the last 7 years. It's properly heartbreaking to learn that after all the hard work we put into restoring Mia, the original Project GU unceremoniously no-scoped her to extract Maha's data. The 2 wouldn't be parted for long, however, as Maha now lives within Entrance's character, a fact he remains unaware of despite his abilities as an epitaph user. We end up data draining the Ida that was infecting him, which took the shape of the cat he called Mia to maintain a steady control of his actions and emotions. To what end, we don't really know. But by this point, Haseo has unwittingly data drained 3 other phases and won the tournament as a result, so even though they're really no closer to unraveling the Ida phenomenon or its connection to Tri-Edge and the coma victims, he's at least got a moment to celebrate. But the moment of triumph isn't prolonged. Ovan has had a few scant appearances over the course of Rebirth. He's the catalyst for Haseo's disastrous meeting with Tri-Edge, of course, but he also shows a clear rapport with Yara, and strangely, acts as a guest commentator during one of the final matches in our tournament. We get the sense fairly early on that he's both observing the events that unfold around our main character, as much as he is arranging pieces on a chessboard. But he most blatantly shows his hand at the crowning ceremony, when he decides to have a word with Adelie. Ovan tells her more or less the TLDR version of .hack roots, and look, I wanted to have a deeper analysis of the themes and story of this companion anime. I really did, but I truly don't recommend watching anything beyond the first half, if anything at all, because it nearly killed my enthusiasm for this project. Over the course of these 26 episodes, and especially the latter 13 or so, it became increasingly difficult to see the show as anything more than an obligation to fill a time slot. Not because of its slow pace, but because the anime has nothing significant to say or explore, and it makes some frankly bizarre writing decisions like trying to shoehorn Pi and Yada in. I do believe that these two would be at the forefront of investigating the oddities that surround Ovan and the Twilight Brigade, but the games do nothing to address the pre-existing tangential relationship that Haseo has with these two, making all these revelations come across as a whole lot of wasted time. It should have been an OVA, or a movie, or better yet, found additional material to cover instead of solely Haseo's early days in the world. As it stands, it suffers the fate frequently endured by many other less than stellar prequels and midquels, maintaining the status quo while signposting the most mundane foundational aspects of the mainline experience in the hopes that the audience will point at the screen like in that one meme. But what it does do a good job of is illustrating how Ovan successfully roped others into his search for the key of the Twilight, providing people like Haseo a greater purpose for playing the game beyond just exploring and leveling up. But it's much less glamorous than it sounds. What the key of the Twilight is, the question of whether or not it even exists and how they might find it, plagues his small team at every turn, and a lot of times it boils down to revisiting certain areas over and over to survey the environment and make note of any changes. Indeed, the quest for this object of fascination is much more a philosophical thought exploration than it is the uncovering of one specific secret item that allows a player to surpass the limits of the game. And as we'll see later on, the key of the Twilight was never just one thing. That is, until it very much is. But as far as roots goes, the brigade splits following Ovan's disappearance. While some believe he found the item he had been looking for and kept it for himself, in truth our enigmatic man of mystery was captured by Yada and Pi. But their attempts to break open the enormous cylinder that encases his left arm end in failure, and the rest we already know as much as we need to. Haseo and Shino grow close, and Shino is eventually PK'd by Tri-Edge, ending up in a coma in the real world. As a first-time player, it's hard to know if Ovan's divulgence of the Twilight Brigade's past is done merely as a means of doling out expedient exposition, but it becomes immediately clear that there is some utility for it as it relates to Haseo and Adeli's relationship. Adeli is incredibly insecure, but she's made some important strides over the last 20 hours. The wins we've racked up in the tournament have given her confidence and a sense of pride she'd never experienced before. And the fact that Haseo relied on her to achieve his goals meant the world to her. But when she discovers that her character and Shino's are basically palette swaps, Adeli reflects on all that's taken place and feels both invisible and used as a result. Like one of the few people who ever relied on her only saw her as a replacement for someone else. And I mean, she's not wrong. Haseo's clearly never had much empathy for others, but the growth he sees in this game, the recognition of the dangerous power of the avatars, the responsibility he feels protecting this game for Syllabus and Gaspard, these seeds finally begin to sprout. Maybe he should start to appreciate Adeli for who she is, instead of the face that he remembers whenever he looks at her. Adeli takes off after this, off to find Tri-Edge on her own in the hopes that doing this one thing might get Senpai to notice her. And so, not for the first or last time, we're left wondering what Ovan's true goal here is. Volume 1 reaches its conclusion with us chasing Adeli into one of Tri-Edge's signs, following her into another one of those creators' rooms. This time, the big bad kite impersonator isn't far behind, and after a whole game of build-up, Haseo finally gets his rematch with the mighty Tri-Edge. Like the vast majority of bosses in these games, there's not a whole lot of strategy involved, but they all share one minor annoyance in the form of unavoidable attacks. Enemies with attacks you're forced to tank aren't negative on their face, but they're more aggravating here because they're not telegraphed in any way. There's no wind-up animation, no audio cue, nothing as far as I can tell, but I suppose this could just be a skill issue. The only defense against these types of attacks is keeping your health topped off as much as possible, and our saving grace this time around is the fact that Tri-Edge isn't particularly strong. So after this in a quick avatar battle, we defeat and data drain the foe we've been chasing since the start of the game. But this is only the first act. Things aren't so neatly wrapped in a bow for us. The coma victims aren't restored, and Tri-Edge doesn't give us a monologue explaining any grand plan. He just Tom riddles. And what's more, Adeli is infected by Ida. With Volume 1, we got basically what I asked for during Part 1 of this retrospective, a more character-driven narrative focused on these shifting bonds forged through an online game. From the opening sequence that slowly captures his character creation, it's immediately apparent that this game is all about Haseo and witnessing every step and stumble of his lengthy hike to becoming a much more empathetic character. In pursuit of capturing the baggage and range of emotion that comes with all of that, the atmosphere of mystery and aesthetic of digital horror is not as prevalent here, but I think that this was all around the right decision for what they were trying to accomplish here. Despite past misgivings, despite him not even being my favorite character in his own games, at this point I've fully bought into watching this miserable lump of angst and edge soften as he learns many of life's most difficult lessons. And though I'll find my level of investment challenged in the future, the first game is a strong start, and the second is likely stronger. Volume 2 takes everything that happened in the closing moments of the previous installment and lets every character and plot thread run with that momentum in its opening hours. Indeed, the continual cascade of events that form its open and close, deeper exploration of its core duo, and its commitment to payoffs make this, if not the strongest game out of the four, then certainly the most memorable. Unfortunately, it also meanders the most out of them all. Each of these games relies on Haseo conquering a different weight class of the arena for story-related reasons. It works in Volume 1 well enough, and they do their best to twist the plot in each subsequent title to suit the needs of this framework, but it never works quite enough to escape the feeling that it's all rather routine, like we're sitting around and waiting for the plot to happen. Things pick up right where they left off. In the aftermath of our tussle with Triage, everyone within R2 finds themselves unable to log out, plucked from their bodies and placed within a mirror server created by Ida, and unable to communicate with the outside world in any way. This opening is a great stage setter. Adeli's infection has left her unable to speak, and as Haseo and the rest of Project GU get a handle on this disaster, there's a mass panic boiling over as normal players collectively begin to lose their minds. Most of them think that they're going crazy, and they even begin to flood the fields we investigate, which adds a lot of believability to the scenario. It's not exactly apparent what happens to those who are killed while trapped in the Ida server, so being the nerd I am, I avoided getting dragged into battle with other players as much as possible. The other big revelation is that Adeli 2 is an epitaph user. It's theorized that if we can track down the Ida that stole her epitaph, we might be able to resolve this mess, but to do so requires more manpower than GU has, so we're off to Moontree to kowtow and request cooperation. I haven't really discussed Sakaki much, mostly in an effort to keep this pedantic piece of writing moving along, but he's clearly some sort of villain. At first, it's difficult to decipher if he's meant to merely play the ideological opposite to Haseo or if he'll take a more active role as an antagonist, but GU ends up showing its hand incredibly early. I don't really take umbrage with this. Not everything has to dress up and try to be an earth-shattering twist, but I do have an issue with the Online Jack episode that gives it away. Yeah, I didn't forget about this creep. I could talk about him breaking into a school or broadcasting the names and homes of children under the guise of investigative journalism, but let's just gloss over that. In the second episode of this show, Salvador breaks into this child's house and the kid says the name Sakaki, like he's in a horror movie, before we get a step and repeat of Ida covering every screen in the home. I wouldn't call this damning evidence that Sakaki is behind the spread of this bug, but this is apparently one of the most popular and irreverent shows in Japan. How does no one, not a single character or forum post, mention this fact? How are rumors not flying? People should be discussing and debating what it all means, and Sakaki should have been GU's biggest target for investigation halfway through the first game. The alarm bells don't even go off at our big meeting, when the guy reveals that he knows all about Project GU and the existence of Ida. Sure, they find it suspicious, but not a soul pipes up about that episode of Online Jack they all watched, but one crisis at a time, I guess. Buy-in from Moontree gives us more boots on the ground for finding Ida, but a run-in with Ovan reveals that there's a much simpler way for resolving the server issue. As a system admin, Yada has access to the backdoors and operations folder needed to shut down the mirror and move its players back to the real world. Huh, so Ovan's privy to the existence of Project GU2. This is much less shocking, and normally I wouldn't trust a single fucking word that comes out of this goober's mouth, but Yada confirms all this anyways when confronted. Evidently, this was too big an opportunity to pass up for investigating how Ida operates and how it can affect the players, and so he decided to sit on his get-out-of-jail-free card unless there really was no other way out. This little maneuver costs him the trust of Kun and Haseo, the former deciding to part from the team due to this little bit of skullduggery potentially bringing harm to normal players. And while Haseo continues to work with the group, his trust for Yada is greatly reined in, and he opts not to divulge a file he picked up from an Ida fight called Ovan 01. Once we hit up the folder and send everyone back to the real world, a large portion of Volume 2 is geared towards another tournament arc that sees us trying to neutralize the Ida that stole Adeli's epitaph. The goal stems from two objectives. The first being to help heal Adeli, of course, but the second being to gather the 8 avatars. Ovan asserts that Ida is called by the epitaphs, and while Haseo no longer trusts the guy in the wake of all that's happened, it's still a thread of information to follow. If the bug is as adamant in understanding the human mind as Yada claims, what better way to go about doing so than to assimilate the programs that are actually capable of interfacing with the psyche? The full picture of Ida's true nature is still missing some pieces, but we've at least got enough clues to start making sense of the discrepancies between what we've believed up until now and what we've seen. So far, we've labored under the assumption that Triad is connected to Ida in some way and responsible for our coma victims. But it's these Balmung and Orca lookalikes descending from the rafters like Sting and their deletion of the Ida bugs that has me thinking their relationship is more competitive than it is mutual. I am right in this, but the game does a pretty good job of throwing a wrench into this line of thinking fairly quickly. We get a message from Pi that Ida signals were detected during the most recent title match at the player arena, and heading over to investigate sees us running into Alcade. When we beat her during the last tournament, she accused us of cheating, and, she's not entirely wrong, but she's also good friends with one of the other emperors, Sirius, and doesn't know who else to turn to. She claims he's been acting strange since around the time of the server fiasco, so it's immediately clear to us that he's been infected by the Ida that stole Adeli's epitaph. However, he's also been seen hanging around with the faux Orca and Balmung, which temporarily throws the aforementioned wrench into my line of thinking that those two in Triad were actually exterminating Ida. With that, we've reached the tournament arc of this game, which feels like a good time to pause and take stock of some of our characters, as I've so far neglected to do so, in favor of keeping this moving along at a semi-respectable pace. Despite .hack GU's heightened focus on characters, I often find myself split on the level of success many of them see in striking a chord with me. First and foremost, this is Haseo's story, his game, and so expecting any character to be as fleshed out as he is would be foolish. And plus, that wouldn't be necessary. The only other characters who come close to his level of development are Adeli and Ovan, and besides, being a fleshed out character and being a good character aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes being likable is enough. Kun is a good example of wasted potential. The game doesn't explicitly state it, but he was actually one of the coma victims from the original games and the ex-boyfriend of one of the main characters from Liminality. With this information in hand, it's not very hard to read his habitual womanizing as an attempt to cover up the gaping wound left by his one serious relationship. There's even one unfortunate moment that sees this oaf hitting on another player that turns out to be, well, a child. The game spins this so that he just ends up wanting to help the kid out because he likes to ensure that all new players have a good time. But I didn't need that travesty of a scene to know that Kun's heart is in the right place. He's shown us this countless times, from his demonstration of the responsibility inherent to the epitaph users, and his resignation from GU over a disagreement with Yada's methods. The fact that he was a coma victim during the second network crisis is completely left on the cutting room floor. This guy could have a wholly unique take on the Ida and Triad phenomenon to serve as the basis of his character. And yes, his life being a mess after all he's endured could be a wrinkle that shows us he's faced difficulties putting the pieces back together after that event, that he remains broken to a degree. But it's all squandered in favor of these tired jokes about how much he likes girls. It just fell flat. And it's an example of how heavily these games can steer into the many anime tropes of their time in lieu of actual characterization. Is there more to him locked behind email threads I didn't manage to trigger? It's possible, but it also shouldn't be up to the side content to make one of our central figures likable. Pi is Yada's right-hand woman, and is by all accounts incredibly loyal to him. The first time we meet her is when she rescues a freshly level reset Haseo from Bordeaux, but the experience doesn't endear them to one another in the slightest. Pai initially sees Haseo as a liability due to his unwillingness to heed others' advice and inability to fully appreciate the potential repercussions that could be triggered by the misuse of his avatar. She attempts to rein him in by sounding as adult-like and professional as possible, but it merely comes off as fake and condescending. And so in the beginning, each is likely to set the other off with only a single word. It's not until Haseo begins leveling out during the second game and Pai tries talking a bit more like they're on the same level that the two are capable of effectively working together. Their relationship continues to improve to the point where they'll be working together in the offline world at the end of the series. And overall, the state of their relationship is a good measurement for gauging how much Haseo has grown up. There's not a whole lot to her we need to cover other than this. She serves a role in the development of our main character well, without really doing anything to weigh it down. I suppose it is worth mentioning that her brother was Jun Bansoya, the former CC Corp employee who once spearheaded Project GU. This never becomes relevant, but it is one of those things you wish was loosely woven into some sort of storyline. But there are shadows of this in what we see on the screen. Her drive to investigate Ida and use the epitaphs responsibly can certainly be interpreted as having roots in a desire to protect or understand her older brother's legacy. So far, it's evident that Yada holds some deep love of the world and is immensely prideful in his position as head of Project GU, which grants him the ability to observe every angle of the game at this terminal called the Serpent of Lore. It's also apparent, and no more so during the server incident, that he's the type to hold cards close to his chest. Haseo's not a huge fan of Yada's tendency to compartmentalize information, but continues working with him regardless as the two share the same goal. I think of Yada very much as Haseo's first boss, that authority figure through whom you learn the art of compromise and balance. And as Haseo matures, he'll eventually learn that there's much more to his supervisor than just handing down orders. While the following information isn't revealed until later, let's just go over it now. Yada is the latest player character of Wiseman, the information broker who helped Kite way back when. After being a part of the effort to prevent the second network crisis, he spent some time as a hacker before being recruited by CC Corp to investigate Ida. He has a couple other characters he uses for the purposes of gathering intel, but his main PC, Yada, is another of the epitaph users. To date, though, he hasn't awakened to this ability, and this little fact is slowly eating away at him. All around, I think this is a really cool development for what's become of Wiseman. There really aren't too many members from Kite's original party that make a return, and what they're teeing up with Wiseman makes a lot of sense for what we've seen so far. Alkaid is a tricky character to pin down, mostly because I feel like we don't spend a lot of time with her before she's PK'd and becomes another lost one. Spoilers. There's an obvious growing love triangle between Adelie, her, and Haseo, a trope I never enjoy, and she gives Haseo a set of blades called the Lit Honeysickles, which definitely live up to their name because I wound up using them well into Volume 3. More than all that other stuff, Alkaid feels more like a writer's device than a character. Not merely a device for adding drama to a tournament that already felt as if it were lacking stakes, but also a device for demonstrating why the player arenas mean so much to so many within the .hack world. The way I've come to look at it, there's increasing evidence that the offline world sucks. Kids are being microchipped, citizens have to wear ID badges everywhere they go, half our cast of characters are being bullied or suffer from depression. Just as they do in the real world, people are using the internet as a means of escape, and this game and all that can be achieved within has supplanted the accolades of the real world. For characters like Alkaid and Sirius, the thrones of the player arena are the means through which they achieve actualization, where relevance gives them a feeling of power, like they exist as people, because, well, in the outside world, people are just another number. Am I reading too much into this? In any event, this is why Alkaid and so many others are staggered when Haseo gives up his Emperor title without a care and joins Alkaid in pursuing Sirius. For him, the tournament was never about etching his name into the annals of history. At first it was about his pride, but now it's solely about helping Adelie and the other lost ones. Speaking of Adelie, she's joined us in this tournament bracket as well. After the Ida server fiasco, she regained the use of her voice, but the theft of her avatar has begun the slow degradation of her character data. This severance between character data and epitaph has affected her real body, and she's since had limited use of one of her arms. I half expected this game to infantilize her by having us turn down her help under the pretense of it being too dangerous, but Adelie is adamant on taking the initiative to solve our problems, and joins us anyways. We're still not ready to talk about Adelie yet. We will later, so let's dive back into the game and get things moving again. While Haseo, Adelie, and Alkaid train for their ascension through the ranks to fight Sirius, CC Corp is doing some damage control in the real world, scrubbing any mention of players being stuck in their game from their forums. But these things are popping up faster than they can delete them, and we even see players looking for friends who have vanished since that day. More and more players are falling into comas, and there's been an uptick in the amount of illegally modified players in the game, all of which are infected by IDA, and therefore unable to be deleted by CyberConnect. Believe it or not, it's also time for Haseo's last job extension quest, which will put him back in the form we saw him in at the start of Volume 1. This quest is taken on with Sylvis and Gaspard, who are really just here because they like hanging out with Haseo. Our resident angry boy briefly backslides into old habits when he leaves the two behind for having too much fun, but he regrets it immediately upon reflecting on his work with GU and promised to protect the game for people like them. This is probably one of the more thoughtful considerations included in Volume 2, to showcase that while Haseo learns some important lessons, he's not suddenly a new person. It takes time to live what he's learned, and he usually finds himself snapping into old habits or covering his altruistic intentions by stating he's only helping others for his own reasons. It's like watching someone get a feel for driving stick. He's got a lot more perspective and a greater grasp on his emotions, but it still takes effort to put it all into practice. So Haseo's back in his old form, the one in which he garnered the title the Terror of Death. But this time around, this power serves a new purpose entirely. No longer being wielded by a psycho looking for revenge, but a young man longing for answers and the strength to help others. Neat. So now we've worked our way through to the semifinals, but this is also the point at which Alkaid is player killed, lured into a trap by someone claiming to have information regarding Sirius's odd behavior. Haseo's too late to do anything about this, and is helpless as Alkaid fades only to become another lost one. I'm in two minds about this, because Haseo knows who Shino is, he's motivated by her current condition, but the player likely doesn't have much context or attachment to her if they didn't watch Roots, so it does feel long overdue to put someone we've come to know in this most precarious situation. But I don't know, I'm just not terribly attached to Alkaid, and as a result, not fully brought into the melodrama. We don't have long to look for a culprit, Bordeaux, recently driven into obsession and insanity by Ida. But before we get our rematch, Adelie is benched from the kerfuffle and Pi takes her place. This is one of those moments where both sides are pretty understandable. It's clearly too dangerous for a player unprotected by an epitaph to join this battle, but it's happening so soon into Adelie's turn as a more assertive person that it also feels like her agency is being taken away. But the writing is smart enough to address the contradiction by recognizing that this is precisely what Haseo and Pi are doing, and that it's a decision in which nobody is really pleased by. So it's time to fight Bordeaux, and oh shit, she's pretty strong. After whittling down Bordeaux's health on my very first try, Entrance makes his grand re-entry to help even the odds. Before Alkaid faded away, she charged Haseo with tracking down this dethroned emperor, and we'll dive into that in a second. But Haseo seemed unable to persuade Entrance to join their cause. So, even though we had registered him as part of our team, we're still forced to enter the match one player short to, artificially up the drama? Surely this mid-match entrance from a player, registered or not, would result in a disqualification. But apparently not. Luckily, I'm given little time to ponder this, as Bordeaux goes berserk, and we get pulled into another avatar battle so we can put her out of commission and extract Ida. Now that Entrance is on our team, let's rewind to the scene where we recruited him. Finding him actually proved rather tricky until we got a lead from Ovan. He really wants Haseo to gather those 8 avatars. Since his defeat, it seems Entrance has taken refuge inside a block of ice deep in that underground lake, eternally watched over by devoted groupie Saku. And question about this. How did he freeze himself in a block of ice? Does he just log into the game and stare up at the surface of the water until it's time for bed? These aren't nitpicks, they're genuine questions. Suffice it to say, Entrance is depressed, and he has good reason to be. He longs for Mia's companionship, and stays logged into R2 24/7 to at least be in the world she was once a part of. The irony, of course, is that Mia is always with him. The avatar of Maha that once resided in her is now a permanent part of his character data. And I don't think anyone really ever brings this up. He seems to come to this realization later if you bother to put in the work for this particular scene, but it's never expanded upon for being such a cornerstone of his identity. In any event, before Haseo could have his chat with Endrance, he first had to go through Saku, and trust me, my Saku rant is coming later. As luck would have it, she too is an epitaph user infected by Ida, so we're able to take what we need from her before being able to properly confront Endrance. Through their brief conversation, Haseo points out the obvious. Endrance was never alone, that he was only denying anything that wasn't Mia. This well-made assertion serves as the impetus for Endrance to put his obsessive dependence on his long-dead friend behind him. There's just one problem, in that he more or less replaces the object of his affection so that he's fixated on Haseo going forward. This is one of those things that is played up for laughs more often than not, but you can't help but feel it should have served as the springboard for his development into a more independent individual, rather than the foundation for a bunch of jokes. Before the title match with Sirius, Adelie changes her mind about remaining benched. Now she wants to get involved. But Pi reiterates what we discussed earlier. The situation and level of danger hasn't changed. If anything, it's increased. But Kun spawns in and offers to take Pi's place. Since leaving Project GU, Kun's been investigating Ida and has been making very little headway. Having seen the extent of what he can accomplish alone, he's resolved to reunite with the team despite his reluctance to trust Yada. And while this is a nice development for Kun, a very grown-up compromising attitude, this doesn't really do anything to resolve Adelie's dilemma. It's just a substitute substituting a substitute, and is clearly a quick way to work Kun back into the plot. This is a good example of what I mean when I say that GU has a lot of great ideas and nearly all of its characters have the basic framework to be compelling, but it often fumbles its attempts to juggle everything that's going on. When things get moving, it can be quite good, but its attempts to bludgeon reason in order to mold its plot to fit into this tournament structure are often so poorly handled that I wind up losing any sense of investment. Let's move on, because this is where we get some clarity on Ida and Tri-Edge. It turns out that these two flanking Sirius aren't the real fake Orca and Balmung we saw destroy Ida earlier, but fake fakes, created by Ida through use of the power of the avatar it stole from Adelie. The real fake Orca and Balmung once again jump in and dispose of these doppelgangers, clearing the way for us to deal with Sirius and revealing that Tri-Edge is being slowly rebuilt within this coffin. Ida, for its part, has once again been manipulating the most negative desires of another player for its own gain. This time using Sirius's wish to hold onto the throne and remain relevant forever as a vessel. With all of this, we've deduced as an audience that Tri-Edge and Ida are separate entities, the former on a quest to exterminate the latter. And it's become steadily obvious that Ida-infected players are responsible for the increased rate at which lost ones are popping up. So then, who or what is the Tri-Edge trifecta? Where did Ida come from? And who's responsible for its spread? Following our second crowning ceremony, we get thrust into what is, by a wide margin, the most captivating part of any of these games. From here on, we're pretty much on a straight shot to the finale, which, despite its pacing issues, is an absolute roller coaster from start to finish. From his introductory scene, it was apparent that Sakaki had some larger antagonistic role to play. Whether it was direct or something else was really the only question. But over the runtime of Volume 2, we see several conversations between him and a handful of others, like Bordeaux, and learn that he's at least partly to blame for the acceleration of the spread of Ida. While he doesn't appear to be the source of the bug, we do know from these scenes that he's intent on learning how to control and maintain mastery over it. But there is a deeper level to his villainy, one we finally see when he at last uses Ida and his uncommonly powerful sway over Adelie to ignite the coup that has long been brewing over at Moontree. So, quick content warning for the topics of suicide and mental abuse. If you'd rather skip that, you can go to the timestamp on screen now. Adelie is not a very happy person. Upon first meeting her, it's easy to write her off as a people pleaser, as wishy-washy, as someone who's putting on a cheerful act as a means of getting others to like her. But this is all a surface-level reading, what we see and what we judge upon meeting someone for the first time. Adelie is, in effect, the darkest logical extreme of one of the series' core conceits: the exploration of people seeking genuine relationships and expression in this fake world. Offline, the ridicule from her classmates about how plain she is, and the contrasting remonstrations from her parents that girls are meant to be silent and reserved, caused her to retreat inward and eventually engage in self-harm. In time, she would find herself browsing suicide-related websites, and there, she would come across Sakaki. Why Sakaki was there, we'll never know. Perhaps he too was dealing with something more serious, but I find it more likely that he simply found pleasure in holding power over others. As Adelie poured her heart out, he played the part of an understanding friend, and she grew overly dependent on his presence and support. Being the reason she began to play R2 in the first place, naturally she would join Moontree alongside her only friend, and it's no wonder why she follows him to every meeting, parrots his every idea, and displays unwavering obedience. For her, the gospel of Moontree is worth spreading because it's the only place she's ever felt acceptance. Their ideas give her confidence, and she seeks to please people because approval makes her feel validated. Sakaki, as you may have guessed, knows all of this. Adelie's overdependence on him has made her malleable to his whims, and following the match against Sirius that sees Adelie fully healed, he uses this twisted relationship to his advantage. By laying the blame for the birth of the Ida server and all that's transpired in its wake at Adelie's feet, Sakaki ignites all of her insecurities. Desperate to make amends and gain back the approval of her friend, she begs for a way out. Man, that was way darker than I was expecting any of this to go. The direction this took completely blindsided me. Not everything I told you is laid out so exactly in the string of scenes that take place during our raid on the Moontree base. Hell, not every detail even makes its way into this game, but the writers trust the players enough to make these inferences and put in the work to learn all of this from Adelie anyways. For a game that isn't always the most subtle with how it displays character traits and motivations, watching this all play out in real time reeled me right in. This entire backstory and the way it unfolds is just excellent, and it's no doubt as effective as it is due to how gradually we've gotten to know this poor girl. TLDR, Sakaki is a massive dick. By infecting Adelie with Ida and using his hold over her to create another mirror server, he's effectively constructed a new playground for testing the limits of control he has over this thing. Before we can dive in though, we have to collect a handful of data seeds. It makes sense from a mechanical perspective that we would first have to gain access to this illicit copy of Moontree's base through some sort of backend or exploit. But in action, these moments only come across as frustrating roadblocks. An impression exacerbated, I think, by the fact that this is the first time Volume 2 has had any real momentum since its opening hours. Our climb up to the top of the Moontree castle itself, though, is plenty memorable, forcing us to take down a set amount of Sakaki loyalists on each floor to bring down a barrier so we can move forward. I haven't really covered the dungeons in GU yet, as I'm sort of saving that for my Volume 3 discussion, but this trek sees us crossing blades with a few mini-bosses, other members of Moontree we've had encounters with in the past. I do wish these battles had more weight to them. I think the writing here is trying to frame these two throwdowns as some sort of battle of ideals, where everyone at odds is incapable of understanding each other until first coming to blows, but it's working way too hard to do very little. To the point where I would have preferred that these two were just completely overtaken by Ida instead of trying to cover a debt they felt they owed to Sakaki. Like, I get they were trying to use these two as a conduit to show the influence Sakaki has had over others, but it just feels distracting and hollow as neither of their reasons for following him are even fractionally as cooked or compelling as Adelie's. But with them out of the way, we make it to the throne room, and it's been given a bit of a makeover. There are moments when .hack dips into the realm of digital horror, and no matter how briefly or lightly they dip their toe into it, it's always done to great effect. This void-like facsimile of a high school hallway is incredibly memorable. Maybe it's just down to how such a familiar-looking environment feels out of place in this fantasy world. Or perhaps it's because of what these halls represent to Adelie. After strolling through the white void and listening to the voices that have tormented her, we're left to confront Sakaki, but he doesn't have the power to handle Haseo himself, and he knows it. He uses Adelie as his sword and shield. I'm not entirely sure how Sakaki's able to witness our Avatar battle, given he's neither an Epitaph user nor infected by Ida just yet, but I'll allow it. Naturally, he freaks out and flees once we data drain Adelie's Avatar. leaving us to pick up the pieces of the girl that once called him friend. The following exchange with Adelie sees Haseo using the time-honored common sense slap to bring Adelie out of her self-flagellation. While I don't think that this scene does enough to convincingly navigate all we've learned about Adelie and the fallout of having just had her trauma laid bare, it's clunky in a way that winds up coming across as more honest than likely anything else that could have been written in its place. Haseo has some pretty harsh words, effectively telling her that if she feels at fault for what's happened, then she needs to take responsibility and action. But where he differs from Sakaki, who would have just told her what to do, he tells her to lean on her friends, because that's what he's learned to do. My friends, Haseo has officially grown up. With Moontree having collapsed, all that's left to do is steamroll Sakaki. The hitch is that Adelie is fully set on accompanying Haseo on this little jaunt. She's aware it's not the best of ideas, as he'll likely hurl more abuse at her, and who knows what that'll do for her well-being, but she's decided to face him head-on, which is a wonderful turn for her character, given all she's faced up until now. When we track him down, Sakaki here is having conniptions over the fact that Haseo was able to best Ida. He really thought his plan was bulletproof, and believes that Ida, which has largely been contained to R2 thus far, can be uploaded to the rest of the net and used to infect and control the masses even in the real world. Curiously, part of Adelie's reasoning in coming here was to find a sense of reason behind Sakaki's actions. Was he always like this, or was this only Ida's influence? Unfortunately, as we know, this is Sakaki's true nature, untouched by Ida. And like every other 2-bit villain, he's first going to have to infect himself with the goods he was peddling so he can deal with these pests. The result is an absolutely unhinged mess. The battle with Sakaki is actually tougher than I expected, as he can hit rather hard. But he also focuses exclusively on Adelie so long as she remains standing in battle, which is a simultaneously terrible and wonderful bit of gameplay narrative cohesion. As satisfying as it is to finally knock this guy down not just a peg, but the whole damn flagpole, it's neither this fight nor his Disney villain death that are the main attraction here. No, the real meat of this section comes in with Ovan, who's quick to congratulate Haseo with a trophy. It would seem he's defeated the recently resurrected Tri-Edge, but he's no longer capable of holding back whatever's been hidden away within the enormous cylinder on his arm. What lies underneath is the truth that most of us had likely worked out by now. That Ovan is infected with Ida, and is in fact the real Tri-Edge responsible for Shino's current state. This revelation is the big plot point that Root spoils by its end, and while internet searches have shown me that many fans don't appreciate this, I'm personally not very bothered by it. I hadn't even reached episode 9 of Roots by this point, but Tri-Edge's true identity is one of those things that feels as if it's supposed to be telegraphed to the audience. We're not given enough to know the how or why, but it feels very clear that the narrative has set up a bait and switch from the very beginning. As Ovan himself said, the journey Haseo would embark on would be one for truth. And if the truth was that his enemy was who he had always believed it to be, it just wouldn't make a lot of sense. This story has always been about testing our main character, so what better way to do just that than by making his enigmatic mentor figure the one he'd been unknowingly chasing all along. After all, a twist on its own is not what makes it impactful. It's typically in the way it recontextualizes our view of the world or characters, or in the case of .hack GU, challenges our protagonists and how they move forward. And so, what's found here is a fairly successful twist, even if it's not altogether surprising. What makes it even more successful is the fact that Ovan, or Tri-Edge rather, PKs Adelie and Pi with absurd ease and little fanfare before heading off elsewhere, leading into the actual endgame for this second installment. The tension from the moment is somewhat deflated by the immediate reveal that Pi and Adelie are doing fine, and we're left to do some busy work in the form of an old favorite, collecting Ida cores that will allow us to open up our actual destination to confront Ovan. Luckily by this point I've grinded to level 100, so the rest of the game is going to be a breeze, but this is just another illustration of needless padding. There was little reason why we couldn't have our showdown with Ovan right then and there. Going from the high of Haseo learning of his old friend's deception to venturing through at least 3 bog standard dungeons only to put us back in front of the guy is just this game shooting itself in the foot while it's making a mad dash for the finish. Our confrontation with the man of the hour reveals that not only is Tri-Edge here the source of the Ida Sakaki had been slinging, but also an epitaph user. Obviously, this is our final battle in this game, and when we win, Ovan merely expresses his dismay that Haseo's not as strong as he wanted him to be. While we've beaten Ovan the man, we don't seem to have bested the Ida that resides within him, and so the victory here is rather meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Haseo, once again, is at a loss, with no path forward for restoring Shino, Alcade, and the steadily increasing number of Lost Ones. Despite fizzling out after a hell of an opening, Volume 2 ends strong with its commitment to putting Haseo and Adley through the emotional ringer. Let's unpack all this. At the start of this roller coaster, Haseo had two goals: find Tri-Edge and cure Shino. With the discovery of Ida, there was a belief that the figure we were calling Tri-Edge and the unknown bug were linked in some way, that perhaps they were one and the same. But as Ida spread to more players and the amount of Lost Ones increased as a result, things made much less sense. Because when Ida appeared, these three were never far behind, ready to exterminate it, meaning that the figures Haseo had been pursuing were likely not behind the spread of this bug. With the closing of Volume 2, we now know that our journey has been orchestrated from the beginning. Ovan has been behind everything. Shino, the distribution of Ida via Sakaki, everything has been done in the pursuit of making Haseo stronger. The reason why is not entirely explicit, but it's rather implicitly understood by the audience that Ovan desires to be freed from Ida. Why it has to be Haseo is really the only mystery here. Now that our two primary villains have stepped into the light, I feel confident in claiming Sakaki is a much stronger antagonist than Ovan, though he's about to wildly overstay his welcome. I don't want to explore this too much without discussing parts of Volume 3 first, but the biggest problem with our newly uncovered chief antagonist is that the entirety of his relationship with Haseo is built upon the foundations of a subpar anime you probably haven't watched. If you know me, then you know I'm the type that believes that, multimedia franchise or not, each individual product has to be capable of standing on its own. And while GU's narrative absolutely does, its protagonist relationship to our primary antagonist does not. And that's a pretty important target to hit, all things considered. As transparent as Sakaki's heel turn was, his entire presence being restricted to the games and the manner in which his schemes intersected with Adley and Haseo's character development gives him a much stronger lasting impression, and makes him a much more satisfying foe to topple. The time skip in the beginning should have been rewritten, and to a degree, it should have been playable. Allowing us to actually take part in the Twilight Brigade's ill-fated adventures with Ovan and Shino would have worked wonders for getting us quickly on board with Haseo's tale of self-improvement. But we don't get that. And as a result, Shino's just some girl whose absence really isn't felt until Ovan gives us some exposition towards the end of Volume 1. And the revelation of his betrayal here comes across as more of a foregone conclusion than the uncovering of an old friend's secret. Where does that leave us? Well, with a third volume that feels like a long overdue attempt to give weight to our story's puppet master. I spent a considerable amount of time piecing together my overall feelings regarding redemption, trying to figure out if I was being too harsh or if there was a greater piece to the puzzle that I was missing. If this is your favorite game out of the lot, that's awesome. But for me, it took a lot of effort to appreciate. To give us a brief rundown, the main components of Volume 3 involve dealing once more with Sakaki, learning of Ovan's backstory, and putting down Kubiya. And only one of those things is necessary or even functions under scrutiny. There's just no ignoring the fact that the majority of Volume 3's scenario is playing a drunken game of improv to justify its own existence, as everything important at its nucleus feels like the last 7 to 10 hours of a game doing its best to straddle a 30-plus runtime. And it's only hampered by the fact that the series' tradition of having us gallivanting through countless dungeons to kill time in between plot beats is on full display. But there's also enough good here to convince me, not for the first time, that had everything in these first 3 games been cut down to 1, maybe even 2 titles, then we would have ended up with a tightly written banger. As stated before, Sakaki is back in the mix, and he's more threatening and cartoonish than ever. With the continued spread of Ida and no end seemingly in sight, CC Corp has decided to sack Yada and install this objectively evil-looking guy in his place. Their reasoning for this is that, despite the absolute chaos he wrought over at Moontree, he's at least capable of controlling Ida. I find this hilarious, mainly for two reasons. Firstly, because it confirms that not a single person in these games actually watches Online Jack, which has already revealed to the world that Sakaki is a 10-year-old running a child cult by way of Ida. This means that CyberConnect has willingly given control of their flagship product to this 10-year-old who's been caught on camera electrocuting self-proclaimed journalists. Secondly, CyberConnect's primary goal is the continued stability and profitability of the world, which flies in the face of reason, given Sakaki immediately makes PKing possible in root towns and opens up another PK tournament in which we're forced to fight under threat of him unleashing Ida particles across the net. In a vacuum, none of these ideas really weigh enough to break the plot, but when put into play as they are here, they do a lot to strain the credibility of this story, especially when it's supposed to be in its third most pivotal act. I know up until now CyberConnect has been portrayed as a bunch of bumbling executives in a constant freefall of bad decisions as they do their best to hamper the work of well-intentioned admins, but this is just silly. On the subject of turning towns into PK zones, I half expected this to mean that we'd be forced to battle some one-off ne'er-do-wells, but that never happens. Towns function the same as they ever have, so it's a plot beat rather than a development that manifests into gameplay changes. I am slightly torn on this, because while being open to attacking towns would have helped to make me feel as if Sakaki's regime had any tangible effect on us, I also would have been pissed if I got dragged into a fight every time I had to run an errand. Still, one or two scripted fights would have been cool. Of course, it's around this point that Gaspard is PK'd while wandering around our new server town, a significant escalation in events from people merely ignoring our shop as a result of Bordeaux's schemes. Again, Gaspard contemplates quitting the game, but doesn't. On its face, this might not seem like such a big deal, deciding to play a game in the face of inconvenience, but with what we know of Gaspard, the fact that he's a victim of bullying and has few offline friends, this wound up coming across to me as one of the more notable moments of a character arc rounding itself off. Maybe I'm crazy, but I find Adelie, and oddly enough Gaspard, the more interesting set of characters in these games. I'm not engaged with the fanbase of .hacks, so I really don't know where these characters fall on the average list of people's favorites, but I have a sneaking suspicion that Gaspard at the very least isn't topping any charts. I just find them incredibly endearing, and they're made compelling to varying degrees through the way they remain emblematic of broken people using this online game not as a source of fun, but as a means to forge connections with others. The moment is understated, but it comes across as even more courageous as a result. This self-professed coward has shed his baggage and decided to stick with the world because it's where his friends reside. So, tournaments. This is now our third run because our Lord Sakaki has mandated that it be so. I've already kind of said my piece on tournaments, and there's really not much to add, but I'll do my best. As discussed during Volume 1, the tournament arc there is primarily concerned with Haseo learning to respect the power of the avatars. In Volume 2, what's most interesting is that throughout the second Palace run, we saw Haseo taking on more of a leadership role, both through coaching Adelie on tactics and Alkaid on reining in her temper, which makes sense because he was much more purpose-driven that time around. But then we saw those leadership qualities slowly bleed into interactions outside of the arena, which lent some import to the proceedings even if the whole song and dance had already become routine by that point. In Volume 3, it's hard to say that anything that happens here is really necessary to any wider tale. There's an attempt to retread old ground as Sakaki tries to return Haseo to the way he was during his PKK days by infecting him with Ida. But I think that's the problem with it, that it feels like an attempt to move backward rather than move the story forward. If this had happened at the previous volume's climax, during a game where Haseo was still dealing with backsliding into old habits, this effort would have been much more engaging, and Haseo's ability to break Ida's hold would have served to underline his commitment to moving forward. But here, it's just done a little too late, and its placement in this farcical tournament just gives the whole thing a pointless monster of the week vibe. And that's all I really have to say about this tournament. Luckily, it won't last very long. So, let's talk about dungeons. Well, Technically, we've got dungeons and we've got fields. Whereas in the previous games, we warped to the field and would have to locate the dungeon from there, this time they're split into different area types. The fields are usually the more expedient of the two, just seeing us collect 3 statues in order to open up the way to the shrine and treasure. Conversely, the dungeons have us doing our normal thing of heading through a handful of randomized floors to reach the end. There are really only 4 dungeon types, and this split between dungeon and field means that the repetition of these same 4 visual templates somehow feels even more limited than before. There are, however, 2 key features that keep dungeons from being overly monotonous, in the form of locked doors and traps. The locked doors are pretty easy to get around. Just carry enough spheres by kicking creatures that appear throughout the map. As for the traps, they're used kind of weirdly. They're a welcome addition, but they appear so sporadically until the latter half of the trilogy, and when they do appear, they're just amassed in one room or hallway. I'm not really sure what way to describe it other than weird. The point of traps should be to catch players off guard, but there's such a strong spotlight on their usage that circumventing them rarely poses an issue. Overall, it's hard to claim that our main fields where we see combat have improved as much as the combat itself. There's the start of something pretty cool here, but it definitely needed more time being kicked around and fleshed out before it was implemented. However, we gain access to area hacking in Volume 3, and it's easily the coolest component of exploration that I wish got added to our toolset earlier, at least on paper. Area hacking sees Haseo scanning the area to reveal anomalies in the data that can yield items like cheat codes, which can be used in alchemy, but it can also be used to open pathways to areas known as outer dungeons. The outer dungeons are pockets of data separate from the rest of the system, and are therefore unable to be monitored, which is why Pi gives us the ability to area hack, so our group can meet up and discuss a game plan without Sakaki dropping any eaves on us. Which, unfortunately, is all this new element is used for. These should have been the back roads we used to slip into locked areas like the IDA server, instead of engaging in a pointless data core hunt. But in place of actual utility, the outer dungeons serve as this woefully underutilized backdrop for our cast of characters to meet up so they can say, hey, we should do something about Sakaki, and all mutter their agreement before logging out without discussing anything of actual substance that warrant these extended dungeon dives. And they are extended. At least 3 separate times we have to go through a dungeon crawl and reach the end of these synthwave deco walkways to watch these hollow dialogue exchanges where our characters sum up everything they already discussed over email. The game is clearly doing its best to pad out the runtime without doing anything meaningful to change the status quo. I was easy on it before because it wasn't as blatant, or had some value in serving the development of Haseo or another character. But by this stage, I'm tired. Sakaki's time as admin and tournament organizer isn't long, but you know what they say about flames that burn twice as bright. As much issue as I have with how he swaggers his way back into the plot, it really is a joy to listen to Crispin Freeman chew the scenery. Sakaki milks every last second to make Haseo's life as miserable as possible, from drawing figures from his past into the bracket, to revealing the existence of avatars to the world and Haseo's use of them in the tournaments. Everything he does here is to hold some sort of power over the man who took his away. But it doesn't really work. Sure, the general public now thinks of Haseo as a cheater, but Haseo's never really cared much for the general public.
Innocent or otherwise.
So Sakaki gets taken out after we claim our 3rd Emperor title. Endrance winds up dealing the finishing blow, having pretended to switch allegiances as a means of getting close to him in a fake defection scheme so transparent and inconsequential that I'm astounded it wormed its way into the story at all. In the end, Sakaki flees to the back rooms here and begs Ovan for more IDA cores. But his well of usefulness has at last been tapped, and it's time for the game to move on to what we're actually here for. So Ovan leaves it up to the ghosts of protagonists past to clean up Sakaki for the actual last time. In between this and the middle section of the game is the Yada retrieval mission. After CC Corp removed him as the leader of Project GU, he went missing in both the game and the real world as well. I actually quite like this subplot with Yada in the way that it adds nuance to what was essentially a static character in IMOC. He's having something probably best described as whatever's found at the cross-section of an existential crisis and a crisis of faith. Since the age of 10, he's devoted his entire life to the world, but it's never really reciprocated that love. Aura left behind the network without so much as a goodbye. He was removed from a position of power that supplied him with much of his self-worth, and now he's the last Epitaph user who has yet to awaken. Yada is feeling very much inadequate. He's tired of standing next to greatness. And luckily, Ovan tracks him down in time to take advantage of these insecurities and is able to poke and prod him enough to spark a meltdown that finally awakens Fidel, the final Epitaph. But with Yada in his current state, it just winds up going berserk. You know, what Yada goes through here reminds me very thoroughly that we never get to choose who cares for us. Personal passions can often cloud our peripherals and eat up our time, but they rarely love us back. Expectations we place on ourselves warp our vision enough to keep us incapable of viewing ourselves the same way the people who appreciate us do. So, yeah, this stuff with Yada is pretty good. And it's one of the few character plots that really nails what it's going for from start to finish. None of this stuff is particularly revolutionary or riveting, but it works because it makes me feel something, and that's all we really want with our stories at the end of the day. When GU actually commits to saying something with its characters, it winds up being an effective story. But it's with its characters that it often falters, and as much as these problems have been noticeable up until now, they've been more like the shirt or two you throw in a closet without so much as a glance. Worthy of note, but you tell yourself, I'll get to that this weekend, over the course of several fortnights. But this weekend is Volume 3, and in actuality, you haven't been putting just your clothes in there, but your kids, your spouses, and your neighbors, and so the door is bursting off its hinges whether you want it or not. Volume 3 is kind of like that, where the writing flaws you were able to accept and shrug away because the overall story still functioned come back and demand to be folded, and it's as messy as this metaphor has been. For every Haseo and Adderley, there's two more hollow shells like Kun or Endrance that wind up being completely one note until the plot decides to do something with them for a handful of beats before they're placed back on the shelf where they can go back to playing their tune unchanged. Like an episode of a show that haphazardly slaps together a backstory for a tertiary character so you can feel something 15 minutes later when they're killed. Nowhere is this issue more prevalent than with the characters of Saku and Bo, or Sakubo. The story we've been fed up until now is that this is a brother and sister sharing the same player character. But if you've been paying attention, then you'll likely have already sussed out that there's a dual personality thing going on. As we learn in this third volume, Saku is a more abrasive personality formed in Bo's mind that emerges to protect him from harm, possibly suggesting an unstable home life. I won't be so brazen and cold and try to claim that the truth at the heart of these two couldn't form a compelling storyline. In a narrative that has occasionally dealt with questions of the identity found underneath the different masks we wear, of an artificial intelligence seeking to understand the human mind, this could absolutely be an angle worth exploring. The rub is that we're not really given enough information in this material to make well-reasoned conjectures as to what Bo is dealing with, and we're capable of enough critical thinking to recognize that the subject of split personalities or dissociative identities isn't being handled with nearly as much grace as Adderley's situation, making our fast-approaching direct intervention in it kind of uncomfortable. Tacked on this subject aside, the writers ask us to care about these two way too late, and give us nothing to grasp when it comes to definable features for either Saku or Bo. Bo's a good kid, but until now has done or said little that tells us anything other than he loves his sister, and the entirety of Saku's personality is formed around this obsessive infatuation she has for Endrance, who doesn't actually speak to her more than once or twice throughout the entirety of all 3 volumes. We don't know why she loves Endrance. Sure, he's handsome and fabulous and totally fucked, but his existence is her entire personality, and every word that comes out of her mouth is in reference to her devotion to him or how she hates Haseo for being the apple of her flame's eye. And it's exhausting. Saku's big focus once Yada's been found is her decision to fade away within Bo's subconsciousness now that she feels her brother is protected by Haseo and that Endrance doesn't need her. We get a choice through a series of email exchanges to convince her to stick with her brother regardless, or to be a jerk-ass and let her fizzle out. And, I'm not a monster, so I did the whole
"Stop, don't come back."
But I don't actually feel anything here, because this isn't a character, it's a caricature. You might be wondering why I'm being so harsh. As critical as I was to the previous set of games, outside of a handful of clunky design issues and an over-reliance on .hack's sign to personify its villain, The story and characters there were completely serviceable in each other's favor, and did little to get in the other's way. But I gripe here because in GU, the people are the story, and the people we're being asked to care about are often handled so ham-fistedly and inelegantly that its execution comes across as detrimental to the overall experience. Yada's rescued, and his status as team lead is reinstated without so much as a "my-be" from the old CC. Though, to be fair, they're probably busy. The existence of Ida has become public knowledge, and the executives are likely huddled over a Ouija board to divine their next scapegoat. With all of that as a backdrop, we're thrust into the mid-game content, which sees us confront Ovan once more. Though, upon closer inspection, not a whole lot happens here other than a bit of running around in search of a mysterious girl that carries an Ida signal. A majority of the developments here are flashbacks and exposition dumps before Ovan summons us for some good old-fashioned no items Fox only. So, instead of taking it beat by beat, let's step back and examine the Ovan of it all. At the conclusion of Volume 2, I made the claim that between Ovan and Sakaki, the latter is the stronger antagonist. After seeing what unfolds in this game, I still mostly stand by that statement. Even though he's the puppet master, the man who orchestrated every move to get Haseo in front of the other 7 avatars, I think where Ovan's most impactful is not in his success as a 3-dimensional individual, but rather in how he's used to accelerate various developments within our protagonist. That might not sound like much of a distinction, so let me try again. Ovan the man is bland and uninteresting because the narrative withholds the source of his motives until the last possible moment. Ovan the writer's device is engaging for how his relationship with Haseo facilitates the exploration of themes like forgiveness and self-sacrifice. Volume 3 reveals to us that Ovan has a younger sister, Aina, a child with an undefined illness that kept her isolated from her brother, and so the only place they could ever spend time together was within the confines of the world. But as a hacker, Ovan was able to bring Aina all over the game. Mostly, they spent time within one of those creators' rooms reading books. That is, until things changed with the emergence of the first aggressive Ida. Up until Volume 3, I had 2 working theories for the bug's origins. That it was either the byproduct of the original Project GU's disastrous go at creating their own ultimate AI, or there were blips in the network as it attempted to compensate for Aura's disappearance. Given Ida's designation as naturally occurring, it's likely safe to bet on the latter. So, the system itself is observing players' behaviors and actions to create its own artificial intelligence. And with an ever-expanding roster of PKers, I suppose it was only a matter of time until one of these things grew hostile towards players. This inevitably aggressive Ida infected Ovan, and its first action after doing so was to use him to PK Aina, making Ovan's sister his first victim. Racked with guilt over his actions, Ovan created the Twilight Brigade with the aim of uncovering the Key of Twilight, hoping that in doing so he could contact Aura and use her abilities to cure his sister. But, as we know, that didn't really work. Eventually, he was captured by Yada and Pi for analysis, and after escaping, Ida again assumed direct control over his character to PK Shino. So, really, it's just been a case of people being in the wrong place at the wrong time whenever he loses control of the Ida infection. Since the dissolution of the Twilight Brigade, it seems Ovan's top priority was to get Haseo to gather and data drain the other avatars. His hypothesis being that if he couldn't meet Aura, then he could manipulate a beefed-up Skaith into data draining him to purge Ida and restore the Lost Ones. But even that doesn't work the way initially intended. That's what Ovan's been up to, using Sakaki to spread the data anomalies just enough to move all the pieces into position on Haseo's path. The chaos and turmoil have all been byproducts of Ovan's 12-dimensional chess game to correct what he sees as his mistakes. However, with Aina's character wandering off under the influence of Ida and Ovan's control over this thing having waned as much as it has, the rules of play are thrown out. While he ends up getting Aina back, he calls us to the creator's room for one final tussle. He's got one last option to resolve the situation, and it's a bit of a gamble. At long last, we have our confrontation with the man who's both responsible for this mess, but who's also been conspiring from the shadows to fix it. There's a thematic exchange between Haseo and Ovan both before and after a fight with him that not only contrasts the way these two view the scenario they find themselves at the center of, but demonstrates how much they could learn from one another. But prior to diving into this scene, it's likely best to properly frame it by discussing Ovan's final gambit. Within the data of Ovan's avatar is the ability known as the Rebirth, a failsafe placed into the black box of the world by its creator Harold. The Rebirth is a reset button for the network, a reinitialization program that can only be triggered by a fully developed Skaith. But there's no guarantee that this thing will quash Ida or bring back the Lost Ones, and there's no telling what it'll do to the one who activates it. But thus far, every scheme has come up short, so it's all Ovan has left to play. It's a plan that will likely end in Ovan's demise, but if we're being honest with ourselves, it's evident that Ovan kinda wants it that way. He's under no illusions that he's some sort of good guy. In the wake of all he's wrought onto others in pursuit of curing Ina, he's long since come to the conclusion that everyone would be much better off if he were to disappear along with Ida. What we have here is a character who cannot communicate or be honest with others, and another who has learned the virtues of such things. It's a long-awaited bit of catharsis, because at this point, Ovan's guard and pretense of control is completely stripped away. The mystery is gone. He's just some guy who manipulates others because asking for help is beyond his capabilities, and he's long since figured he doesn't deserve any. But what's clear here is what was clear nearly 80 hours ago when we first broached the topic of tournaments with Adelie. Had this guy properly confided in someone who views him, however estranged, as a friend, then that friend would have done what they could to help someone they cared about. However, in this clash of personalities, ways, and means, Haseo learns his last lesson. One of those things you hear as a kid, but can't grasp until you've lived its meaning. That there's no going back to the way things were. Haseos thus far believe that saving the Lost Ones will bring everything back to normal. But even if the victims are returned to their bodies, things have changed. Haseo's no longer the brooding little shit he was when he was data drained. The experience of being comatose will have no doubt changed Shino, Ina, and the others, and who knows if Ovan is even walking out of this intact. Things might get better, but they will never be like they were before. This sequence does a lot of legwork for redeeming Volume 3 in my eyes. Some of the material, like the haphazard introduction of the Rebirth, is handled with little finesse, but on the whole, it's thematically very strong. The battle against Ovan himself, like many other boss battles in these games, doesn't require too much. He's got some Ida orbs that can heal him, but if you destroy those, he's no trouble to take down. Of course, once this is over, he summons Korbanik for a showdown with Haseo. Given what we know, this clash is framed much differently from the other times Haseo has used Skaith. In most cases, it's used for saving others or clearing out Ida, and sure, that's all here to a degree, but this time around, it's done with the knowledge that should Haseo win this fight, he's probably going to put Ovan in a coma. Not all that long ago, he was reveling in his avatar's power and couldn't care less about the consequences. But here we are on the precipice of finally putting this triage thing to bed, and Haseo's fully aware of what he's about to do to someone he once called a friend. In the afterglow of all this, and the subtext found in their conflict, I really felt the tension going into our deathmatch. That tension, unfortunately, gave way to a bit of frustration. This avatar battle is the instance I mentioned earlier that put the system's shortcomings on display. So, maybe it's just me, but there is nigh zero depth perception in these fights. I just can't tell how far away some of these projectiles are before they come barreling in to chip away at our health. And I'm not sure if I'm the only person who's had this issue. There's only one way to damage Ovan here, and that's of course to bounce one of his attacks back at him to take down his barrier. Returning this thing to sender requires that you hit it 4 times, but Haseo's final attack in his 4-string combo has a fairly long windup. So what we have here is a perfect storm. Unless you hit this thing dead to rights, it'll ignore your first 3 melee strikes and come in to hit you anyways before you can unleash the 4th. If you're as bad at video games as I probably am, you're in for a lot of Ovan screaming for Haseo to surpass his limits as you try and get the timing down. Fortunately, that's the only frustrating thing about this battle. Once you've got the rhythm down, just rinse and repeat until you can finally perform Data Drain. Oddly enough, this emotionally resonant material, the resolution our narrative has been building towards for 2 games, is only the second act of Volume 3. I don't think where it's placed is a bad decision in and of itself. After all, exploring the fallout of the events that our story has worked its way up to is an interesting concept that could add additional layers of nuance to what we've witnessed. And to the game's credit, there is a thematic thread teased out once or twice between Haseo and the recently awakened Aina that's very reminiscent of the struggle people face when grappling with the loss of a loved one. But the substance immediately evaporates as the story trips over itself to up the stakes as much as possible with the reintroduction of Kubia. It feels wildly shoehorned in, and helps to deliver a finale that's disjointed and always hustling to create any sort of momentum. First, we dealt with Sakaki's brief jaunt as an admin, and that was fun at times, but in a Saturday morning cartoon sort of way. Then we threw down with Ovan, which by my measure is the only section of the story that actually delivers. To cap things off, Kubia's back, and now we have to stop this abomination from igniting Armageddon. There are seeds to these conflicts that work. On paper, all three events do have connective tissue, but in execution, the finale winds up feeling very episodic in a fashion that was likely not intended. Being present at Ground Zero for the activation of the network reset blows Haseo to Kingdom Come, and he regains consciousness on the fringes of the system, his character data fractured and his mind in danger of being lost owing to the relationship between an Epitaph user and their PC. To piece himself back together, Haseo finds himself in the void of main character inner turmoil, where he reaffirms his commitment to the people he's grown to care for since starting this journey. And I suppose this is the best time to fully divulge his backstory. Haseo isn't new to the .hack universe. His real name is Ryo Masaki, the kid who played as Sora in .hack Sign. Had I known that going in, I probably would have highlighted this character more in the previous video. But as interesting as this revelation is, it's not really intrinsic to our understanding of his development. If you're already aware of this fact, then it adds some additional weight to the success of his character arc, and it makes this one scene at the end of Roots where he tells Silver Knight to fuck off absolutely hilarious. But I don't want to delve too deeply into material we've already covered. At the end of Sign, Sora became the first coma victim of the Cursed Wave, technically second if you want to count Tsukasa. With this defining moment in the appearance of Sora's empty character, along with Skaith's wand and outbreak, it's clear that the incident that led to the creation of Skaith forged some deep bond between the terror of death and Ryo Masaki. And it makes sense that Skaith would seek out this bond when it absconded into the network in search of a compatible player. So I think that's what this film-negative version of Haseo that appears within his mind is supposed to represent. The personality of Skaith that was created using what he had data drained from Sora way back in the day. It's not entirely clear. As far as I can tell, the games on their own don't really overtly put a stamp on the whole Sora equals Haseo thing. But when exploring the wiki to fact-check for this video and gather the real names of our characters, I found that they are one and the same. And so I have to wonder where this information comes from. Is it a novel or manga? Or perhaps some developer interview? I mean, I don't doubt Haseo's origin story here. Terminal Disk does allude to the fact that Sora's player later gets involved in Project GU. But it reminds me that a lot of information on these wikis and the like are taken for granted, and little bits of detail that shine a light on characters or events can wind up becoming so ubiquitous to the fandom that people can forget how the information was learned in the first place. Not that this is the case here. What I'm trying to say is that when doing these videos, I like to reference related sources of information, both official and fan-related, to check my work. But I still prefer to put forth my perception of the story and events because I just don't know where in the canon some of this information stems from. And if I get something wildly incorrect in my understanding, I like to leave it up to the 8 or 9 people who actually sit through these avant-garde panic attacks masquerading as videos to debate whether I was incorrect because the story faltered in its clarity, or because I'm stupid. So Sora is Haseo, Haseo is Sora, and if that passed you by when you played this, I don't blame you. But whether or not you've had this epiphany, the scene still does its job. Our protagonist has now fully accepted every facet of himself, the good and the bad, and he's reborn in an elegant new form to symbolize his self-actualization. This is Haseo's 8th form, but that took me 17 times to say right, so we're just going to call it his 4th form. We have Zelkova to thank for this long overdue ability to handle airborne enemies. He's not just the former guildmaster of Moontree. He's the one who oversees the net slum and directed it to pick up Haseo on the boundaries of the system. Yeah, the net slum is mobile now, and on the back of a giant turtle. Zelkova's always displayed a level of clairvoyance beyond that of normal players, so this revelation isn't overly shocking. Is he a hacker? Is he something more? While the answer is definitely there, it's not until Volume 4 that it's confirmed that Zelkova is indeed a sentient AI. Now that he's awake, Haseo learns that Ovan's gambit was a success, though he's been lost as a result. The aggressive Ida has been purged from the network, and the lost ones are slowly recovering. Offline, the spirits have answered CC Corp's summons, and they've decided that they'll be blaming the entirety of the Ida fiasco on Masato Indo, better known to us as Ovan. But with Ida purged from the network, you might be wondering why everyone's still up in arms. Well, Kubia's back, of course. The explanation for Kubia's return is nonsensical and nebulous at best, and you already know what I think of its implementation, so let's just look at the facts. It's explained that the power of the Rebirth cast a light so bright on the immense power of the 8 phases that an equally massive shadow was cast. This shadow is Kubia. And unlike Ida, which remained largely contained to the world aside from a few blips, Kubia's presence is placing a strain on the entire network, and it's grown beyond the game. It's no longer just GPSs and malfunctioning coin lockers we're worried about. Entire nuclear power plants around the planet are beginning to melt down, and there's even a space station getting ready to fall from orbit and land right on Tokyo. And all of this is being blamed on Ida. I'll say this, GU really goes for broke when it comes to raising the stakes at play. So that's what we've got to contend with. The world is actually ending, and the only way we can prevent Armageddon is by getting rid of Kubia. To do so sees Haseo at last taking on the mantle of leader and spearheading an initiative to lead as many players as possible into areas under significant stress and rid them of as many of Kubia's little spawns as possible to slow the degradation of the network. I have a feeling that this is why the last third of the game exists. To put Haseo in a position to inspire a bunch of players and showcase the impact, marginal or substantial, he's had on people over the last 3 games. But we still have no plan for handling the main threat itself. The way Pai and Yada explain it, Kubia and the avatars are polar opposites, so anything they do to one another will have 0 effect. But as we'll see, this explanation winds up being completely inconsistent with how the game plays out, because as DBZA Goku would say, it turns out they just have to punch it really hard. We find ourselves back in the Hulgran's Cathedral with Aina and Yada. I don't have any hard-hitting analysis on Aina. She does have a much more fiery personality than I anticipated, being much less meek and docile than the little sister archetype we typically see. Instead, she's initially furious that Haseo couldn't have done more to help her brother. But over the course of several encounters, she comes to understand that she's merely been taking out her grief on our main guy. Her and Yada have dragged us to the cathedral because it's the only place in the world that's ever had any tangible connection with Aura. Turns out, Ovan left Aina with a complete copy of the Epitaph of Twilight. Well, I say complete, but Emma died before she finished it. But given it was located in one of Harold's creator's rooms, it's probably as complete as it gets. Now in the cathedral, the book resonates with Aina and, wouldn't you know it, kicks off a chain reaction that ignites within Haseo as he now holds the power of all 8 avatars. Realizing that he is the key of the Twilight, Haseo activates Skaith and digivolves into his final form. This turn of events summons the ghosts of protagonists past, and it's a hell of a fight. It's actually the best boss fight in these games by a wide margin. There should be no tension here. We know these guys aren't malicious at this point, but part of the system. Nevertheless, they've been built up so effectively over the course of the preceding 80 hours that I felt only hype as the fisticuffs commenced. It's a straightforward brawl, forcing you into a balancing act of trying to keep Orca and Balmung out of the way so you can keep hammering away at this kite impersonator. These guys hit hard, even in my overleveled state. Once we prove our worth, Aina halts the 3 with a word. Aura is speaking through her now, thanks to the gathered avatars and the presence of the Epitaph. These 3 pursuers, as Ovan called them, are Aura's knights, created to watch over and cleanse the system in her stead. We don't really get a full explanation as to why Aura disappeared. Even so, I think we can infer enough from her attitude and actions to make a well-reasoned guess. And the results feel allegorical, like we're watching the genesis of a creation myth. It is clear, through these games and the last, that regardless of the man-made nature of the network, it's taken on an autonomy of its own. And events that transpire online can have a palpable effect on the offline world and vice versa. Digital it might be, but its inextricable link with the real world has made the network just another layer to the human domain. The human mind can be trapped here in what's essentially become a seedbed for consciousness. Life, of a sort, can be born here. And Aura is at the center of it all. She's referred to constantly by numerous people as the goddess of the world. And there seems to be a suggestion that she eventually grew uncomfortable with the moniker, hence her disappearance. Graced with the presence of his deity at last, Yada asks Aura for the silver bullet to Kubia. Yet, she's not tripping over herself to get involved. Aura is withdrawn from the world and has submerged herself in the sea of data, trusting that it's time that the people look to themselves if they're in search of a solution. And that's it. Aura's out. For now. With Aura having effectively said, I don't know, lol, we're at the point of no return. NetSlum now has the ability to connect to any of the servers, giving us our base of operations as we lead the attack on the little Kubia monsters in several areas. As we hit up several zones across R2 and quell the overflow, we meet up with every character we've encountered over the last 3 volumes. Pyros, Syllabus and Gaspard, a mid-redemption Bordeaux, a recently restored Alcade, even the 2 who PK'd Haseo at the start are here to help. And with the extermination of these little gremlins putting a moratorium on Kubia's expansion, we're given our only opening to pursue the big bad himself. Zelkova's tracked him down, so it's now or never. The last dungeon in this game is sadly no different from the last several hundred times we sashayed through these corridors. With the network falling apart, I was eager to see textures peeling away to reveal the mesh or code underneath. Maybe a haphazard fusion of different visual templates blended into a Jackson Pollock to illustrate just how unstable the system had become. But no, just this fucking forest again. With that and a quick waltz through another outer dungeon, we find ourselves staring at Kubia's ugly mug, and it's time for a good old-fashioned boss gauntlet. What starts as an avatar battle soon transitions into on-foot combat as we take the fight to the inside of the beast itself, which is always cool. Even if I don't like the implementation of Kubia in the story, they always manage to turn it into a fun set piece. Once we're inside and we can confront the core, we're in for a pretty fun final confrontation. I know Big Thing hangs off a ledge and offers up different parts of its body for you to hit in sequence isn't a new concept, but it doesn't have to be. It's well paced, makes good use of our full skill set, and winds up being a great time as a result. There's really not much else to it other than that. Pace yourself well, and we can sit back and watch the ending. In spite of the surgically precise beating we just administered, the day isn't quite saved just yet. In an 11th hour effort to just kinda be as much of a dick as possible, Kubia prepares to self-destruct, which would rend the network and guarantee all sorts of calamities. With no other options left, the group lend their avatars to Haseo so he can prevent the worst, but the attack just isn't good enough. He's 1 epitaph user short. That is, until Aura throws us a bone and connects Ovan's consciousness with Haseo's, lending us the power of the Rebirth. We get a montage of all the major moments we've witnessed, the successes and the struggles, the laughter and tears, as Haseo gets his G Gundam moment and announces that he's pouring all of those feelings into one final attack. And you know, I gave this game a lot of flack, and I'm not entirely sure it earned this moment. But I ate it right up. I don't know why, but I live for this stuff. I just had the biggest smile on my face. You can probably hear me smiling right now. The story might have had a few fumbles on its way down the field, but it spikes that fucker hard once it makes to the end zone. In watching that Kubia core finally crack, I wasn't thinking of the missteps this story took or my frustrations. I wasn't thinking of what to jot down in my notes about the parts of the scene that I found cheesy or contrived. I was just reliving the emotions of the entire journey. I felt like I climbed a mountain, and I felt good. Volume 3's ending isn't all that happy. Its sweetness has teases of the bitter as well. After all, things might get better, but they will never be like they were before. Ovan and Haseo have a bond at this point that goes beyond words. Their friendship and eventual conflict has brought them to a place in which they can fully understand one another. I think there are a couple ways you can read the scene that follows, in which Ovan vanishes into the world instead of returning to his body. Either he has no wish to, due to the guilt of his actions, or that even if he wanted to, he's unable because his consciousness is still lost deep within the network, and it was only his desire to help Haseo that briefly connected the two. Either reading works. Some time passes, and we get the usual slew of emails from friends and admirers, all in celebration of what we've accomplished. I'm pretty sure Syllabus and Gaspard still have no idea what's going on, but I love them anyways. Offline, CC Corp's ever-shifting narrative and the slightly more severe revelation that they've been falsifying player records causes them to rescind Ovan's arrest warrant, and again, become the bullseye for public and legal scrutiny. I know there's still a few more entries in this series, but I don't know. Looks like it might be serious this time. I actually brought up Salvador Ihara a lot less than I anticipated throughout this whole ordeal. Though, to be honest, you haven't missed much. He and his team were arrested after breaking into CyberConnect properties in the course of their investigation, but were eventually released from custody. In the final episode of his show, Salvador and his crew sit around and reflect on the fact that they never really uncovered what Ida was, as we learn that the kid who played as Sakaki apparently went to the Gilderoy Lockhart School for Comeuppance because his villainy has left him with amnesia. But the biggest surprise from this last episode is the very end. Gino's finally been discharged from the hospital, and as Salvador laments their unenlightened state, she crosses the frame and tells him that Ida's true nature is opposing mirrors of hope and despair. And honestly, I don't even want to attempt to unpack that. Sometime later, Haseo gets the email he's been waiting for months. Shino's logged back in, and she wants to chat. We find her in the cathedral, of course, but the slight awkwardness of the reunion is only doubled when Adelie shows up. It really is uncomfortable to watch, and Adelie's clearly uncomfortable being there, as she doesn't really know what she can say other than to offer Shino congratulations on a recovery before running off in embarrassment. As Adelie takes off, Shino proposes to Haseo that they restart the Twilight Brigade with the intention of finding Ovan. But Haseo's long since learned that things aren't ever going to return to the way they were. The kid who only a few months ago set out on a single-minded revenge quest to win Shino back isn't the same person now standing in front of her. He's done what he originally set out to do. And perhaps he's ready to look to the future for once. So he leaves the church and runs after Adelie. And that's Volume 3. Yeah, it's a bit of a mess. If you couldn't tell, I didn't love it. Sometimes, I didn't even like it. But in the face of all the criticism that would so persistently floweth from my pen with righteous anger, I still found myself completely emotionally invested in the outcome of Haseo's coming-of-age tale. Which I think speaks volumes to just how good everything that actually works here is. Just how strongly the framework of the story and how we engage with it on a mechanical level can get us invested. For all its shortcomings, GU does a great job capturing the messy, difficult process that is growing up. Accepting your flaws, challenging yourself to be better, shouldering responsibility, but above all else, learning how to understand others and open yourself up. After all, growing up sucks, but it does lead to some pretty incredible moments. Usually in writing these overly long, highly indulgent videos, I do my best to find the positive in what I'm writing about. Because, in full transparency, negativity takes a lot of energy to maintain, and usually isn't worth it. Not for its own sake, at least. That said, it's also important to be honest in how we resonate with the media we explore. What it does right, where things could have been handled better. I did a lot of fault-finding this go-around, and I'm sure it probably sounded petty at times, but I hope it was never overbearing, or at least only occasionally so. In any case, before I dive into my final autopsy and wrap this thing up, we've got one more volume to discuss. Thankfully, it's a short one. Reconnection was written and made specifically for Last Recode some 10 years after Volume 3 had served as the de facto last word on this era of the franchise. Well, there was a bonus anime episode called Returner that previously served as an epilogue, but it seems its events have been overwritten by Volume 4. I'm sure there's an argument to be made that the episode still fits on the timeline in some way, so it's not a hill I'm willing to die on, but it's not something I'm able to personally reconcile given how events play out, and thus, I won't be covering it. I had a lot of criticism for Volume 3, but I have virtually none for Volume 4. This is a celebration for fans, included to add some closure and a chance to reconnect with the characters that you vibed with. On the whole, it's, well, perfect. Or rather, it's exactly what it needs to be, and it doesn't overstay its welcome, clocking in at just around 4 hours. There's no emails, no news articles, and no new forum threads to read. There's just you, Haseo, and a mad dash to wake up Ovan. I won't spend too much time on this. It's been a little over a year since the Kubiya incident. Haseo's taken up work with Pi at the Network Administration Bureau, and has been pouring all his efforts into combing through data to get a lead on Ovan's whereabouts. In the real world, Ovan's body is beginning to deteriorate, and CyberConnect has announced that they'll be shutting down the servers to the World R2 in only a few days, which would effectively kill him. So Haseo logs in for the first time in months to follow a trail of information that of course leads to Ovan. And it looks like Ovan here has taken the entrance route of staying encased in ice until someone hard-headed enough to get through to him comes along. Unfortunately, motivating speeches alone won't cut it, and neither will brute strength. Despite our best efforts, we're unable to break him out without the use of the avatars, Zelkova having sealed them away after Volume 3 to prevent another Kubiya from awakening. So, which is it? Is it merely the gathering of the 8 avatars that summons Kubiya, or was it Ovan using the Rebirth? And come to think of it, why would the phases of the cursed wave coming together cause Kubiya to spawn? These things are part of the black box left behind by Harold and were presumably all one being for a long time before Morgana split them up to create her little hit squad. Surely these beings that belong in the system wouldn't be considered an anomaly. Anyways, we're off to find Zelkova, but we learn from this new character Kusabira that Moontree's former guildmaster has been kidnapped by this new data anomaly known as Shadow Vagalta. We find out a little later that Kusabira is the remnants of the Triage Ida that previously infected Ovan, cleansed of its aggressive tendencies by the Rebirth, and given form as a full-fledged AI. She helps us rescue Zelkova, and we bring him back to the net slum where he's able to unseal the power of the 8 phases, elevating Haseo to his 5th form. This thing is utterly broken, and I wouldn't have it any other way. All her weapons have been replaced by the 8-phase sword, a blade that can be broken into fragments to function as a whip. But that pales in comparison to the main attraction here, which is that the skill trigger has been replaced with 8 abilities that each represent a different epitaph, and every last one deals massive damage. It's glorious, and a superb gift for what's essentially a victory lap. Freeing Ovan from his popsicle proves to be a little challenge with our new drip, but we find he's still unable to wake up. That is, until Kusabira rejoins with him. Again, I'm reminded of the fact that .hack seems to be spinning its own creation myth. Not only is the network capable of sowing and cultivating its own form of life, but we have one of these AIs that is now seemingly integral to a human. On some level, Ovan and Kusabira complete one another. There was initially some part of me that was very wary of Volume 4's primary objective to bring Ovan back. His submerging into the network at the conclusion of Redemption felt like the proper ending for his character, and I was worried that walking it back would dampen the theme I brought up numerous times about how part of growing up means accepting change. But I think the writers end up walking the line very well, because what's shown here is a different kind of growing up. Ovan got everything he wanted by essentially sacrificing himself, and was happy to disappear. But in doing so, he kind of forgot that people like Haseo, Shino, or Aina would miss him. Rather, he convinced himself that everyone would be better off without him. And disappearing meant that he wouldn't have to go through the reconciliation process with any of these people and actually open up to them. He claims that martyring himself was the only way Ida could have been properly cleansed. But in actuality, he was just running away. So Haseo offers him a choice. In a mirror to the very start of this tale, he lays out 2 paths in front of Ovan. One in which he's safe but turns his back on reality forever, and another laid with peril as he fesses up to his insecurities. But amidst the peril, much like Haseo's own path, lies truth, and very likely, pride. Volume 4 is fan service and circular storytelling done right. With Ovan back on our side, these two blitz through the final dungeon and defeat the anomaly, who was never really important to the story. Good as it is, it was always a transparent effort to give Haseo and Ovan their great big team-up moment and show off this swanky new animation. And that's it. The cast is fully reunited, and as a player, you're given one last day to explore the world in perpetuity. It's kind of perfect, but not in a way that feels cheap or phoned in. It feels very much earned. At the conclusion to the first part of this year-long endeavor, one of my main takeaways was that I would have liked to see a reimagining of Imok's story with a much more character-driven focus. And in many regards, GU delivers on that concept. For as much as it's a clear sequel, so many beats and ideas are remixed and put into use here that, at multiple times throughout my playthrough, I found myself musing that the objective of the project may just well have been that, to take a different approach to the material they covered before, while still advancing the timeline. .hack GU is a much more ambitious title than its predecessor, but delivers a product that feels even more inconsistent. It might look great, the combat and general mechanics may have seen immense leaps in quality, but it's hard to ignore the amount of times we're forced to traipse through the same corridors time and again, only to be rewarded with cutscenes where little or less happens in the way of development. And the very nature of the game's attempt to prolong its tale over the course of 3 games only shines a greater light on its biggest gameplay weakness, dungeon design, and turns combat encounters from fun to monotonous very quickly. The games aspire to say and do much, but they take overly long to get where they need to go, and usually by hitching a ride on half-formed ideas. A feeling amplified perhaps by how underutilized its cast of characters outside of a handful wind up being, or how often its characters lean on lazy archetypes as shorthand for doing anything at all. Which feels wild to me. I just spent well over 100 hours with these people, and outside the obvious few, I don't think I could tell you any more about them than I could the cast from the previous games. But as damning as all that sounds, I still think that these games are worth giving the old college try. It's a unique experience, and the coming-of-age tale that serves as its engine hits its mark so well that this 30-something-year-old who had what I'd call a dormant awareness of the franchise remained invested throughout. I mean, don't listen to my bitching. I got everything I asked for in a sequel, and I still, by a slim margin, prefer the previous set of games. And yeah, that's an execution and scope issue, but the cynic in me says it's because I'm a picky hypocrite, and you should never trust a single thing I say. As for where .hack goes from here, well, there's no telling, though it appears to be dead or in the middle of a long hiatus, but who knows, maybe they're cooking something. Since GU, there's been a smattering of new entries, such as a movie, a fighting game, and another mainline entry called Link. But it's been a long time since there's been anything substantial outside of this remaster nearly 6 years ago. Out of curiosity, I stole a glance over what some of this other material adds to the series lore, and let me just say, I think I'm going to stop with GU. Though to be fair, reading a plot summary and experiencing a story yourself are two completely separate things. It might be possible that Link and some of this other stuff is pretty good, but I don't know. I have a feeling it's not really for me. But I'd like to see more. Not because there's some grand plot underway that I'd like to get the resolution to, but because there's so few experiences like it in terms of setting. And the paradox of getting to know people better online through a game than you could in the real world is a powerful one, and perhaps more topical than ever. If things do continue on in some form though, I hope they just focus on telling one good self-contained story at a time. And I hope they give it a soft reboot. Everything that's happened can remain canon to the events of some hypothetical new story, but I have a hunch that trying to continually tie things into Harold, Aura, and Emma while adding a sprig of coma victims would only restrict them. Branch out, tell new stories, and explore new themes that are linked to what's found at the core of the series. Star Wars doesn't have to be all about the Skywalkers, you know, but that's a whole other can of worms. So yeah, .hack GU is good. Not pretty good, not bad or mediocre, just good. And that's fine, because our worst qualities do not define us. Thanks for watching.